They were young lovers and friends searching for a place to fit in.
They were going to be on the adventure of heading to start a life together.
She was very excited about what the future was going to be for her.
But a terrifying crime would bring their adventures to an end.
She obviously wasn't killed right away. She was tortured.
In their search for answers, investigators must piece together a complicated puzzle of conflicting stories between two couples to determine who is telling the truth and who is leading the conspiracy.
He was a quasi kind of a cult leader. He liked to control people through fear.
I was just telling the boss, like, stop him. Just make him stop.
You knew there was more to the story.
And then he said, man, if you don't help me bury her, man, I'm going to kill you too.
That's when the real torture started.
It just leaves you with an empty feeling. It's hard to comprehend.
Densely forested and tucked in a remote corner of northwestern California, the Trinity Alps Preserve is the second largest wilderness area in the state.
The Trinity Alps is a huge wilderness area between Redding and the Pacific coast. It's massive in size.
It's very dark out there, and if you go down the wrong road, there's trouble. There's a lot of people that actually live out there to kind of keep a distance from law enforcement, make their own rules.
It's a place where you can be by yourself and not be bothered.
On the morning of April 18th, 1998, Shasta County authorities receive a call about a derelict campsite.
There was one tent standing. You could see there had been another tent there, but it had been removed.
There was debris everywhere. There were empty liquor bottles. There was signs of possibly a struggle or something that had taken place.
There was dried blood all around, and that's when then I was notified to start a search warrant.
The whole investigative unit was called in. They sent the cadaver dog up with its handler to the campsite, and the dog immediately went to the fire pit.
As the investigative unit begins clearing debris, they make a horrific discovery.
The police gently dug through the fire pit, and eventually they found a hand. And they discovered a partially burnt body buried underneath the campfire.
The victim was naked. She had a black plastic, like garbage bag, tied around her head. It definitely appeared that she'd been struck several times in the back of the head. She had bruising, all over her body. There were cuts on her arms.
Investigators immediately contact the coroner's office for assistance.
The coroner estimates the body had been there 10 to 15 days, but it was in really good condition for investigative purposes. It was inside the fire pit covered by wood, so it was not disturbed by wildlife or any environmental elements.
While the body is removed for autopsy, authorities continue processing the scene for clues.
One of the pieces of evidence that we located in the campsite was a small purse. And inside the small purse was a driver's license identifying a person by the name of Laura Sinner, even though she matched the picture on the driver's license. We want to make 100% sure.
Detectives will have to wait for dental records to confirm their victim's identity. In the meantime, the driver's license is the only hint they have. Born on October 25, 1977, Laura Sinner grew up on a dairy farm near Yakima, Washington, the youngest of 3 siblings.
Laura, as a young girl, she was fun. She was cute. She was always smiling and seemed like happy, even when her 2 big brothers were picking on her.
When Laura was 8, her parents divorced. Still, Laura always appreciated the value in family. As she got older, she yearned to help those who had none.
I remember Laura's high school days. She volunteered a lot with our mom.
My mom was very into religion and church and brought us up as a Christian family. It was a big part of our life.
Mom started doing foster care. She was working in some caregiving fields, and then one of her friends, they were fostering some children, and my mom thought that, we had room, why not? We got this little boy named Joshua.
My sister really took a liking to Joshua, and that became a big part of her life. She enjoyed helping others, and that was kind of her Christian spirit, to help others. It was just her personality.
Following her freshman year of college, Laura spent the summer of 1997 volunteering at a Christian mission in Aberdeen, Washington. There, Laura would meet the love of her life.
There was a young man that had come through the food line, and she kind of noticed that he kept coming through, and it was this young man named Tim.
Tim Smith was from Redding, California. He had moved up to Washington State for a change in life when he ended up meeting Laura. Tim was so smitten by her that he started volunteering at the mission so he could get to know her better. They were quite happy with each other.
Laura definitely liked Tim. She always wanted to be around him.
So she went through the things that we all go through when we, meet our first love.
By the end of summer, however, the budding romance hit a rough patch.
He didn't have any money, was always begging for money from my sister. He just didn't seem to have any drive.
They ended up breaking up, and it broke Laura's heart.
Less than 2 months later, Laura suffered another devastating blow when her mother fell ill.
She went into the doctor for that and found out that she had leukemia, and it quickly progressed.
She went into the hospital October 8th and died on the 31st. So it was like a couple weeks of not knowing she was ill to she's gone. Mom was Laura's life. It devastated Laura. She kind of lost it. Where do I go? What direction do I go? It really threw her for a loop.
To ease the pain, Laura sought the comfort of her former flame, Tim Smith.
I think Laura was emailing him. She had reached out to him, and somehow he figured out how to get her to take him back to where his family was from. And that's where I found out that Redding, California was like his hometown.
And that's where she started developing this, well, maybe we could go to California or make a change in her life so that she could become a happier person. She saw this opportunity with Tim to try something different.
In March of 1998, Laura and Tim packed their belongings into Laura's car and headed south to visit Tim's father in Redding, California.
She said that they love each other. They're going to go down, meet his family, get married, start a life there. I mean, she was 20. That's kind of what 20-year-olds do.
But Laura's happy ever after would come to an untimely end. Only 1 month after she arrived in California, police believe they have found her body at a campsite in the Trinity Alps wilderness.
We did ultimately find family-sized large can of chili beans that had hair, blood, evidence, and it was dented.
Police suspect that this can was actually used as a weapon on the victim. And with the amount of force taken to make this kind of dent, you can only imagine the level of rage and anger that was behind it.
Coming up, as police dig deeper into their victim's life, her family leads them to someone with opportunity.
Knowing that he was her ex-boyfriend, he was the one that brought her to the area. He was certainly a person of interest.
But a tell-all confession shifts investigators' attention from one couple to refocus on two couples.
She came forward to tell investigators that she had information about Laura's death.
I told him don't do it. So I have to. He's going to kill me just like he did her.
In April 1998, police have discovered the brutalized remains of a young woman at an abandoned campsite.
Dental records were requested, and when they received those dental records, we were positively able to identify the victim as Laura Sinner. As the autopsy was conducted, it was ultimately determined that the cause of death was a massive blunt force trauma. Also, the coroner's report stated that the blood alcohol level was 0.78. The legal limit for being under the influence of alcohol is 0.08. When a person gets to the area of 0.4 to 0.5, they are generally completely incapacitated. And anything beyond that, there's an extreme possibility of death, either through alcohol poisoning or just your body shutting down.
The coroner said that someone would have to be forced to drink that much alcohol because it's physically not possible to do it on yourself.
It's terribly shocking. She obviously wasn't killed right away. She was tortured.
We contacted Laura's father in Salem to advise him that we had located her body and that she was deceased.
Are you sure? Are you sure it's her? I mean, come on. She's too nice. Who would do this? I mean, she'd give you the shoes off her feet, the shirt off her back, her last dollar. Like, it's just not possible.
We were just devastated as a family. My father was crushed. It was hard for him to live with, hearing that happened to his daughter.
Laura's father tells investigators that he had been worried about his daughter ever since she moved to California with her boyfriend, Tim Smith, nearly 5 weeks earlier.
He was so concerned because he hadn't heard from his daughter from the time she left and moved to Redding that he contacted the Salem Police Department and reported her as a missing person. Shortly after that, he received a phone call from her.
Laura had called her father to inform him that Tim had actually broken up with her.
On March 27th, I emailed my sister and I said, I'm concerned. I know that Tim and you have broken up and I want to help you. And if there's something going on and you need help, let me know.
The offer was made by her father to give her money for gas so she could return to Salem. She declined those offers and said that she did want to stay in Redding.
Laura's father told investigators that the last he spoke to his daughter was on April 1st. And he hadn't heard from her since then, and he just assumed that she stayed in Redding and that she and Tim were just trying to work things out.
Knowing that Tim was her ex-boyfriend, he was the one that brought her to the area. He was certainly a person of interest.
Law enforcement locate Tim Smith in Redding and take him into custody.
We brought Tim in to major crimes and interviewed him.
When police eventually confront Tim and let him know that Laura had been murdered, he seems legitimately shocked. He insists he knows nothing of what happened to her and that the last time he had seen her was March 30th.
According to Tim, 2 weeks after arriving in California, he broke up with Laura following a series of arguments.
He described the relationship that he and Laura had and how it changed after they got down to Redding.
Tim explained that very short time later, they split up. Laura decided to stay, and she was staying at his father's house due to the fact that she actually became friends with Tim's family.
She met Tim's brother Paul, Tim's sister Lori, her boyfriend Eric Rubio. They all seemed to get along.
Lori and Laura had a fairly instant connection with each other, and Laura wanted Lori to be her maid of honor when she married Tim. Lori felt very close to Laura and once told her that she was like the sister that she had never had.
When Tim and Laura broke up, she really had nowhere to go. So she asked Paul and Lori if she could come and live with them. Tim decided he would just keep his distance and let Laura have her space.
She was excited about these friendships where she had been alone. She had very little in her life after her mother died.
When police asked Tim about the last time he spoke to Laura, he claims it's been nearly 3 weeks. He explains he doesn't spend much time with his younger siblings, 20-year-old Paul Jr. and 18-year-old Lori, because they didn't always see eye to eye.
It became very apparent this was a dysfunctional family.
Tim tells police that from a young age, he and his siblings had never had a real place to call home.
The kids spent most of their time in foster care, bouncing around from one place to another. They weren't always together.
It did appear that Tim had moved away, started a productive life, was moving forward. Paul wasn't able to do that. He was in the system, continually in the system, and really struggled to lead a productive life.
Even after he got out and became an adult, he continued this type of activity. He was a car thief, burglar, and was involved with that kind of way to support himself rather than get a real job.
His sister Lori had her own problems in foster care and ended up in juvenile hall a few times also. In late 1997, the family all reconnected and lived underneath Paul Sr.'s roof in Redding, California. The brothers hadn't seen their sister Lori in years. She was almost a stranger, but she reconnected, especially with Paul Jr.
Once they reunited, basically as adults, they became very close. They clung to each other.
Tim tells police that Lori began dating one of Paul's best friends, 19-year-old Eric Rubio. At the same time, Paul met a 14-year-old girl named Amy Stevens.
My understanding that Amy Stevens was a runaway, that she'd been in the foster care system, and she had ran away at this point, and that she was now hanging out with Paul Smith as, quote, a boyfriend.
Paul convinced her to run away from the foster home and move in with him, which she in fact did. She idolized him. He was everything to her.
Tim says he hasn't seen his siblings since he and Laura Sinner broke up 3 weeks earlier. Now that Laura has been found murdered, he suggests police should immediately find and question them about the last time they saw Laura.
When interviewing Tim, I really, truly felt he was a good guy. I felt he was actually very worried, and that possibly some responsibility since he's the one that brought her down here. Obviously, you still have that thing in the back of your mind. There's a possibility, but he was very cooperative.
As detectives continue to gather information from Tim, they receive a surprise visit from Paul Jr.'s girlfriend, Amy Stevens.
I'd received a walk-in report of a juvenile who stated that she was hooked up with an adult and he was on a crime spree. She was scared.
Amy came forward to tell investigators that she had information about Laura's death.
In Redding, California, police are investigating the murder of Laura Sinner when 14-year-old Amy Stevens comes forward and claims she knows who killed her. When investigators sit down with Amy, she tells them she had recently met Laura through her 20-year-old boyfriend, Paul Smith, when Paul and his sister Lori offered Laura a place to stay.
There were two couples with Eric and Lori and Amy and Paul. She said Laura was kind of disruptive to the group. She was the fifth wheel.
She felt that there were times when Laura seemed to be flirting with Paul. It seemed like Paul would flirt back with her as well. And this agitated Amy.
Amy tells investigators that on April 7th, the group decided to travel to the Trinity Alps for a camping trip.
Paul had invited Laura Sinner to join the two couples on the camping trip. Now, Amy admits that she was not happy about that at all. But they set up camp and they were having a good time hanging out. But later in the evening, Laura started flirting with Paul.
She said that Laura had kissed Paul, and she got very angry.
She actually ran up to Laura, punched her in the face. At that point, Laura was able to physically push Amy back, and the two of them fell down on the ground, and then Laura was on top of Amy.
She told police that then Paul stepped in.
Amy described that Paul had grabbed a can, hit Laura in the head.
Amy tells investigators she was terrified by what Paul did next.
She described that Paul had grabbed a dent puller.
Dent puller is a device used by body repair people to pull dents out of a car. It has a heavy end to it, and he beat her with that.
Eventually, Paul struck her to the point where Laura was no longer responsive.
According to Amy, she was angry when Laura tried to kiss her boyfriend, but she had never meant for her to die. Fearful of Paul, she had stayed quiet about the murder, but her conscience had weighed on her, and she decided she needed to come clean to police.
I truly felt sympathy for this young juvenile. She was scared. She just wanted to report this. She wanted something done to Paul Jr., and I thought her motives were pure for reporting it.
Amy confirms that Laura's ex-boyfriend Tim Smith was not present at the time of the murder, eliminating him as a person of interest. After telling her story, Amy puts investigators in touch with 18-year-old Lori Smith.
Lori went to speak with investigators knowing that Amy had done the same thing herself.
We just want to talk to you, under arrest or anything like that. And when we're done visiting, we'll get you right back. Okay?
According to Lori, Laura Sinner had driven her, Eric Rubio, Paul Smith, and Amy Stevens to the Trinity Alps campsite on the afternoon of April 7th.
Paul was making us all of us drink alcohol. He was like playing a guilt trip on us. So, well, if you don't drink this, it's messed up because I spent my money on you guys buying this alcohol for you. And he made us all feel bad, so we all drank 3 cases of Budweiser and almost a gallon of whiskey. And so Laura started flirting with him. She started grabbing his butt, hanging all over him, hugging him, gave him a kiss on the cheek. And Peter got mad and started yelling and screaming at her.
Lori then explained that ultimately Paul got angry about it.
He started beating up on Laura. He took her where we consider where he can make us watch him beat her up. It was his primary device, like, stop him, just make him stop. He kept beating her.
Smith said that she was not helping because Paul had threatened to kill them.
He tied her up with a rope, put a rope around her neck, tied her legs, and tied her arms and threw her on a wrestling mat by the tent, and his arm then sliced her wrist open. So I'm gonna make it look like you tried to kill yourself. And he made us watch that.
Then he put a bag over her head and beat her more with the dent puller.
When he took the dent puller and just started hitting her right here in the back of her neck, between 15 and 20 times, and you can just see her bones and her body crushed. And he was my fiance, Eric, Malcolm Barrier, and Eric's just sitting here like, I have to do it. I told him, don't do it. So I have to. He's going to kill me just like he did her.
After they left the campsite, Paul had told everyone involved that if they said anything, that he would kill them or have them killed. Lori really believed it. She was in absolute fear of Paul carrying this out, so she hadn't said anything.
Lori Smith's account of the murder ends the same way as Amy Stevens, but investigators notice some discrepancies between the two stories.
The biggest difference was that Amy admitted that she initiated the physical contact.
Lori Smith blamed everything on her brother, Paul Smith, and said that he was the one that injured and assaulted and then eventually murdered Laura Sinner.
The fact that their stories were that much different made us think we aren't even close to what really took place.
Detectives have to wonder, are Amy and Lori telling the truth about Paul? Or are the girls hiding their own motives for wanting Laura Sinner dead?
You knew there was more to the stories.
They decided it was worth investigating Eric and Paul, who is pretty much a loose cannon and a violent person.
Coming up, in search of the truth, investigators get a new perspective, forcing them to reconsider who is the crime's true mastermind.
Because we were all couples and she was the only one without somebody.
There was lots of contradictory statements, everybody wanting to distance themselves. At no point did I see any remorse.
In Redding, California, detectives are searching for 2 men in connection with the brutal murder of 20-year-old Laura Sinner. Both Lori Smith and Amy Stevens have confessed that their boyfriends, Eric Rubio and Paul Smith Jr., were involved. On April 18th, detectives track the men down.
Lori advised us that she'd received calls from Paul Smith, who was in custody. We checked the arrest log and determined that, in fact, Paul Smith and Eric Rubio were both currently in custody on a car theft arrest.
What they were doing were going out. They were trying to steal vehicles, and that's what eventually put Paul Smith and Eric into jail, was they got caught with a stolen Jeep.
With the information we had already received, talking to the girls, We decided Paul was probably the most responsible about everything took place, so we felt it'd be better to talk to Rubio first.
We've been talking to several people, and I understand that something might have happened out at the campsite.
And what campsite might this be?
That's what I'd like for you to share with me.
And why does, what does this pertain to?
I think you have a real good idea about what this pertains to.
And why is that?
You were there at the campsite.
And who says this?
Well, Lori, Amy. Okay, so what we need to do is for you to be honest with us and share with us what happened. And I think once you do that, you will feel better with yourself.
Faced with possible jail time, Eric finally decides to come clean.
We asked him what he could describe took place out at the campsite. He was reasonably candid.
Eric described their campsite as not a really happy place. There was a lot of drug taking and drinking going on and flirting going on, and tension was rising in the camp.
According to Eric, the source of both couples' tension was Laura Sinner.
Laura was, I don't know, I guess, an outcast. Because we were all couples and she was the only one without somebody.
Eric said that due to the fact that Laura was an outsider, she was really getting on everybody's nerves.
Rubio described to us that Amy initially assaulted Laura, punched her in the face, knocked her against a tree. Two of them fell to the ground, and they were wrestling on the ground. Laura started to get advantage on Amy.
Lori jumped into it because it was believed that Laura Sinner was winning. So they all fight.
Amy went over, retrieved this 2-pound can of chili beans, and then came over and struck Laura in the back of the head 2 times.
Unlike Lori's statement that Paul was the initial aggressor, Eric claims that the 2 girls were the first ones who used the can of chili to beat Laura Sinner.
Lori then stepped in, took the can from her because Amy wasn't strong enough to really do any damage. And then Lori struck her multiple times in the head to the point where Laura finally collapsed on the ground and they stopped.
Okay, what happened to Laura? She was laying there on the ground, crying. Was she bleeding? Well, she was bleeding when she got up towards the tent, and I saw her head.
What did you say?
I just, like, a gash in her head.
According to Rubio, the 2 girls helped Laura up and walked down to the creek, which is about 20 yards away from the campsite. They started rinsing off Laura's head in the water, and it was at that point they could see that the skull was crushed.
When the girls returned to the campsite, they left Laura to rest against a tree. Eric claims that's when Paul produced a razor blade.
Tied her up and then asked her, out of the blue, from nowhere,
Asked her.
are you going to cut your wrist or you want me to do it?
Okay, and what did Laura say?
She said, I'll do it.
Okay. What happened then?
And then she did it.
She didn't want to do it. She made some cuts into her wrists that weren't very deep, which angered Paul.
That's when the real torture started.
At that point, Paul took the razor blade from her, made the cuts more deeply. Laura was still crying out, "Why are you doing this?" She wasn't dying.
At one point, Paul grabs a bottle of whiskey, puts it in front of Laura's face, and tells her she's got to drink the thing because he doesn't want her to feel any more pain. So she drinks practically the entire bottle.
She wasn't passing away fast enough for him, so Lori proceeded to get out and hit her with the dent puller. But I guess to PJ, she wasn't hitting her hard enough, so he took her away from her and told her to get in the tent, and he did it.
Eric and Amy were inside the tent, trying not to hear the sound of Laura's murder just happening just feet away from them outside of the tent. Finally, they heard a snap. That was her neck being broken.
This poor girl was in agony, extreme pain, and unbelievable fear for a very long period of time. It's hard to comprehend. It just leaves you with an empty feeling.
He came to the tent, and we all sat there for a minute. He said, "Man, come help me bury her." And I was like, "No, man, that." And then he said, "Man, if you don't help me bury her, man, I'm gonna kill you too." So I got up and I helped him bury her.
Are you fearful of Paul?
Yeah.
Why?
Because he's a lot bigger than me, and not only because of that, because if he's capable of killing one person, he's capable of doing it again.
Unlike Amy and Lori's statements, Eric's account implicates Lori in the bludgeoning of Laura Sinner.
There was lots of contradictory statements, everybody wanting to distance themselves.
But all three accounts say the same man delivered the fatal blows. Now, detectives turn their attention to the alleged killer, Paul Smith Jr.
It was finally time for the police to talk to Paul Smith. So he told the police, just kind of offhandedly, "Yeah, I'll take the blame for this."
Police have interviewed 3 suspects for the brutal murder of 20-year-old Laura Sinner at a remote campsite in Northern California. Amy Stevens, Lori Smith, and Eric Rubio all say that 20-year-old Paul Smith Jr. is the real killer. As detectives listen, Paul corroborates Eric's account that the fight had started between the 3 girls and ended with Paul.
In his mind, Laura was not going to live. Her skull was crushed, and that, in fact, she would eventually die. Then he decided he didn't really want her to suffer. He described hitting her in the neck several times. And then at some point, he described that he did hear a snap.
Paul told police that he gave each one of his friends an assignment to help him clean up the crime scene.
Paul was the type who, it appeared to me, needed an entourage of people to look up to him, think he was their, he was their protector. He was the bad man, not afraid of anything.
He was a quasi kind of a cult leader type person, his personality. He liked to control people through fear.
That's why he surrounds himself with young people, people that he could intimidate. Amy was in foster care, ran away from foster care. Obviously, Lori Smith had a dysfunctional childhood. Eric Rubio had a dysfunctional childhood, had no one he could really count on.
He threatened everyone around him once they were close to him. This guy was absolutely the worst of the worst.
But ultimately, all of them were involved in it. And at no point did I see any remorse on the 2 girls.
It's like that pack of dogs. If you have one dog that's a little bit more aggressive, then next thing you know, everybody's attacking.
Less than 3 weeks after Laura's death, Paul Smith, Lori Smith, Amy Stevens, and Eric Rubio are all indicted for her murder.
In my 30 years of law enforcement, I don't recall ever arresting multiple couples involved with a murder.
On July 10th, 1999, Lori Smith pleads guilty to murder. 11 days later, her now fiancé, Eric Rubio, does the same.
Eric Rubio and Lori Smith made a deal with the district attorney's office to testify against Paul Smith, and that's where they did get a reduced sentence.
They were sentenced then to 15 years to life with the possibility of parole. Amy, being a juvenile, she went to juvenile court, but she was sentenced to the maximum for juvenile, which would mean she would be in custody till she was 25.
In 2002, 4 years after Laura's murder, Paul Smith Jr. finally goes on trial. On the stand, he maintains his original statement that his girlfriend Amy and his sister Lori were the first to attack Laura Sinner.
Paul Smith testified that he had only put Laura Sinner out of her misery because he felt she was going to die anyways from the injuries. That was his defense, that he had done her a favor.
The jury obviously didn't buy into that theory, and Paul Smith was eventually convicted on the charges that were brought against him.
He was sentenced to death row.
I think justice was served for Paul Jr. I don't think justice was served in regards to Amy and Lori. Is it enough for Laura Sinner's family? Wouldn't be enough for me.
There's nothing I could say to any one of them. We've lost our sister, and it hurts 20-some years later, like it was yesterday. Laura deserved better.
Laura really trusted people and saw the good in people, and they took advantage of Laura's goodwill and good nature.
Here was an innocent girl that got caught up with the wrong type of people, that it ultimately cost her her life. And that's the saddest thing there is.
I love you, Laura.
The last thing anyone remembered about Maria Ridulph was how ordinary the evening had seemed. A 7-year-old girl standing outside her home in Sycamore, Illinois, playing with her friend on a December night in 1957. There was nothing about that evening that warned the quiet neighborhood that within minutes, a little girl would disappear and begin one of the most haunting cold case investigations in American history. Maria had been playing outside with Kathy Sigmund when a stranger approached them. The man spoke to the girls. He teased them. He offered to give them rides on his sled. Then, in a matter of moments, Maria was gone. Kathy ran home. The alarm spread through the neighborhood. Police arrived. Neighbors searched. The small Illinois community suddenly became the center of a desperate hunt for a missing child, and almost immediately, investigators were confronted with a problem that would define the case for decades. There was a witness, but there was no certainty. There was a description, but no physical evidence capable of identifying the man. There was a timeline, but no way to reconstruct every minute with confidence. The search intensified, and eventually the investigation expanded beyond Sycamore. The Federal Bureau of Investigation became involved, and even J. Edgar Hoover followed the case closely. Maria's disappearance had become national news, but the answer remained hidden. Months passed before Maria's body was discovered in April 1958 by mushroom hunters in a remote area near Woodbine, Illinois, roughly 20 miles east of Galena. The little girl who had vanished from a neighborhood street was now at the center of a homicide investigation. Her body was badly decomposed, making forensic examination extraordinarily difficult by the standards of the time. Investigators determined that her death was consistent with suffocation and/or strangulation, but many questions could never be answered. There was no modern DNA technology. There were no surveillance cameras. There was no digital trail. There was no database capable of connecting biological evidence to an unknown offender. The case depended heavily on memories, statements, timelines, and human recollection. And one of the earliest people to attract suspicion was an 18-year-old local man named John Tessier, who would later become known as Jack McCullough. Tessier lived only a few doors away from the Ridulph family. That proximity made him relevant to investigators, but it was his claimed whereabouts that ultimately removed him from suspicion. McCullough said he had been in Rockford that evening and had contacted his parents from a post office there. Investigators accepted the alibi, and the case moved forward without him as a primary suspect. The investigation eventually went cold. Maria's name remained in police files, in newspaper archives, and in the memories of people who had watched a child vanish from an ordinary street. Years became decades. Decades became nearly half a century. Then, in 2008, the case suddenly moved again. Illinois State Police reopened the investigation. A statement from Jan Tessier, McCullough's half-sister, directed investigators toward her brother. The old suspect who had once been cleared was suddenly back at the center of the investigation. The story seemed almost impossible. The man once investigated and dismissed was now being accused decades later. Investigators revisited old statements. They examined the original evidence. They looked again at witness recollections. They reviewed the history of the case with the tools of a modern investigation. In July 2011, McCullough was charged with Maria's kidnapping and murder. The arrest shocked people who had lived with the mystery for generations. The oldest memories of the case suddenly seemed to have become relevant again. A cold case that had survived more than 50 years appeared to have finally found its answer. Maria's remains were exhumed for additional forensic examination. McCullough was brought back to Illinois. Prosecutors prepared their case, and when the trial began, the central question was no longer whether Maria had been kidnapped or whether she had been killed. Those facts were beyond dispute. The question was whether the man sitting in court had been the stranger who approached two little girls on a Sycamore Street in 1957. The prosecution relied heavily on testimony and the circumstances surrounding the old allegations. The defense challenged the identification and the timeline. Memories that had survived more than half a century were placed under the intense pressure of a courtroom. In September 2012, after a bench trial lasting about a week, McCullough was found guilty. In December, he was sentenced to life in prison. To many observers, the story seemed finished. The cold case had been solved. The suspect had been convicted. The little girl whose disappearance had haunted Sycamore for decades had finally, it appeared, received justice. But there was a problem. The evidence that had produced the conviction was not as solid as the verdict made it appear, and years later, another examination of the case would begin to unravel the entire conclusion. Richard Schmack, the DeKalb County State's attorney, became increasingly concerned that McCullough may have been wrongly convicted. He began reviewing the case, not casually, not from a distance. He went back through thousands of pages of documents, including old police reports, FBI material, grand jury records, trial transcripts, affidavits, and other investigative files. Somewhere inside that mountain of paper was the question that could determine whether the conviction was justified. Where exactly had McCullough been on the night Maria disappeared? The answer depended partly on a telephone call. McCullough had said he was in Rockford and had used a payphone. If that call could be reliably connected to a particular location and time, it could change everything. In late 2015, Schmack found a document containing the telephone number associated with the call. When the old information was examined against the FBI's original timeline, the picture became dramatically different. The original investigation had apparently contained information supporting McCullough's claim that he was in Rockford at the relevant time. The very evidence that had once helped clear him had not disappeared. It had simply been buried inside decades of paperwork. In April 2016, McCullough's conviction was vacated and he was released from prison. The man, once described as the answer to America's oldest cold case, was no longer legally responsible for Maria's murder. The shocking twist was not that DNA had exposed a hidden killer. It was that the supposed solution itself had collapsed. The case had gone from unsolved to apparently solved incorrectly, and then back into the darkness. The title of the investigation had changed, but the central mystery had not. Who was the man who approached Maria and Kathy that December night? Who took Maria away? Who transported her from Sycamore? Who left her body in rural Illinois? And why did the truth remain hidden for so long? Modern technology has transformed cold case investigations, but technology cannot manufacture evidence that no longer exists. DNA can be extraordinarily powerful when biological material is preserved and usable, but Maria's case presents the fundamental difficulty of an investigation that began in an era before forensic genetics. The physical condition of the remains and the limitations of the original investigation created enormous obstacles. What remains are fragments of memory, old records, testimony, investigative conclusions, and unanswered questions. The case became a warning about the danger of believing that a conviction automatically means the mystery has been solved. For Maria's family and for the people of Sycamore, the story did not end with the courtroom. It continued through archives, arguments, appeals, and painful reassessment. A child disappeared. A body was eventually found. A man went to prison. Then he walked free, and somewhere inside those 60 years of evidence and uncertainty may still be the clue that explains what really happened. Maria Ridulph was 7 years old when she vanished. She never had the chance to grow older. The community did. Investigators did. Witnesses aged. Memories faded. People who knew the original story died. Buildings changed. Streets changed. Technology changed. America changed. But one question remained almost exactly where it had been on that December night in 1957. Who was standing there when Maria disappeared? The answer has never been established in court. The conviction that once appeared to close the case was overturned, and the man once presented as the killer was ultimately cleared of the crime. That leaves a cold case without the ending that headlines promised. There is no final confession, no definitive DNA match publicly establishing the murderer, no courtroom verdict identifying the person responsible. Only the echo of a child's disappearance, the memory of a frightened friend, a trail of investigators who refused to completely forget, and a mystery that survived longer than almost everyone who first encountered it. More than half a century after Maria vanished, the case demonstrated something far more unsettling than the discovery of a killer. It demonstrated how easily an unsolved mystery can appear solved, how a theory can harden into certainty, and how justice sometimes requires the courage to admit that a conclusion was wrong. Maria's name remains attached to one of America's most enduring cold cases, not because the killer was finally exposed, but because the search for the truth survived a failed conviction. Somewhere beyond the headlines, beyond the courtroom, beyond the mountains of old paperwork, the real answer may still exist. And until that answer is found and proven, the final chapter of Maria Ridulph's story remains unwritten. By the time investigators understood that Maria Ridulph had not simply wandered away, the quiet streets of Sycamore had already become the center of a desperate search, and every passing minute seemed to make the possibility of finding her alive more remote. It was December 20th, 1957, a bitter winter evening in northern Illinois, and Maria was outside with her friend, Kathy Sigmund, doing something completely ordinary for children of that era. They were playing together near Maria's home. There were no smartphones recording the moment, no security cameras watching the street, no digital footprints showing where a person had gone. There was only the testimony of a child who would soon become the most important witness in one of the country's most enduring mysteries. According to Kathy, a man approached them and began talking. He was not immediately perceived as a terrifying stranger. He interacted with the girls, joked with them, and offered them rides on his sled. That detail would become crucial because it suggested that whoever approached Maria knew how to make himself appear harmless, at least long enough to get close. Then the situation changed. Maria disappeared. Kathy went home and told her family what had happened. Suddenly, what had been an ordinary winter evening became a frantic emergency. Adults rushed outside. Neighbors began searching the surrounding area. The question spreading through Sycamore was brutally simple. Where was Marie? The first hours of a missing child investigation are often decisive, but in 1957, investigators did not possess the technology available today. There were no automatic license plate readers. There was no widespread network of electronic surveillance. There were no cell phone records capable of reconstructing movement. Even forensic science was operating within limitations that would seem almost unimaginable decades later. Investigators had to depend on people, paper, telephone calls, physical searches, and memory, especially under stress, can become complicated. Yet Kathy had seen the man. She could describe him. That gave investigators something to work with, but it also created a danger that would follow the case for decades. The possibility that an uncertain recollection could become more certain with every retelling. The search quickly expanded beyond the immediate neighborhood. Authorities began examining people who lived nearby, people who had been seen in the area, and anyone whose movements might have placed them near Maria. The investigation attracted enormous attention. The disappearance of a 7-year-old girl in a small American community was the kind of crime that could terrify an entire generation of parents, particularly at a time when children routinely played outside without adults hovering over them. The image of Maria became familiar to the public. Her photographs appeared in newspapers. Her disappearance became a national story. The Federal Bureau of Investigation became involved, and the search took on a scale far beyond the boundaries of Sycamore. Investigators needed answers, but every possible lead seemed to produce another question. Where had Maria been taken? Was the offender local? Had he been watching the neighborhood? Did he know Maria? Had the kidnapping been planned, or had the opportunity appeared suddenly? And perhaps most importantly, was the man described by Kathy someone investigators had already encountered? One name entered the investigation early. John Tessier, an 18-year-old man who lived only a few houses from the Ridolph family, became a person of interest. Tessier later became known as Jack McCullough. His proximity to Maria's home naturally attracted attention, but investigators also had to examine his account of where he had been that night. He maintained that he was in Rockford. He said he had traveled there and had contacted his parents from a post office. That alibi became a critical part of the early investigation. At the time, investigators accepted it, and Tessier was not charged. The significance of that decision would not become fully apparent until more than 5 decades later. For Maria's family, however, there was no such thing as an investigation being finished simply because one suspect had been eliminated. The child was still missing. Search parties continued. Authorities pursued leads. The public remained alert for information. Then the worst possibility became reality. In April 1958, nearly 4 months after Maria vanished, her remains were discovered by 2 mushroom hunters in a wooded area near Woodbine, Illinois. The location was roughly 20 miles east of Galena and far from the neighborhood where Maria had last been seen. The discovery transformed the investigation from a missing child case into a murder investigation. The distance between Sycamore and the place where Maria was found immediately raised another disturbing possibility. Someone had transported her. Someone had driven or otherwise moved her away from the place where she disappeared. That meant the killer had not simply acted and fled on foot. There was another layer to the crime, another journey that investigators had to reconstruct. But reconstructing a journey more than 6 decades later is extraordinarily difficult, especially when the original investigation had no modern geographic technology. The remains were badly decomposed, limiting what investigators could determine. Authorities concluded that Maria's death was consistent with suffocation and/or strangulation. Yet the forensic evidence available in 1958 could not provide the kind of answers investigators might expect today. There was no DNA profile capable of being entered into a national database. There was no sophisticated genetic genealogy. There was no digital evidence. There was no modern way to determine who had touched Maria, who had transported her, or who had left biological material behind unless that material survived and could later be analyzed. The investigation therefore returned to the human evidence, the witness, the timeline, the suspect list, the statements, the memories. Every detail mattered because there were so few details available. Investigators had to ask whether the man Kathy described resembled anyone in the community. They had to determine whether Maria had known him. They had to examine who had access to a vehicle. They had to consider how a child could be moved from a residential street without attracting enough attention to stop the offender. These questions were not easy to answer in a town where people knew one another and where rumors could travel faster than facts. Maria's death shocked Sycamore, but it also changed the way people thought about safety. Parents who had once allowed their children to play outside without concern now understood that something terrible could happen in a place that had previously felt secure. The disappearance became part of the town's collective memory. Years passed, but the case did not disappear completely. The files remained. The photographs remained. The original statements remained. And the unanswered questions remained. Then another complication emerged. As the decades passed, the original investigators aged or died. Witnesses grew older. Some memories became less reliable. Some people who had known Maria were no longer alive to explain what they remembered. Yet the case continued to attract attention precisely because it had never reached a definitive resolution. The mystery was not merely that Maria had been killed, it was that investigators had never been able to establish, beyond a legally sustainable case, who had taken her and why. For decades, the name Jack McCullough remained connected to the story because of that early investigation, even though he had not been charged at the time and had maintained his innocence. Then, more than 50 years after Maria disappeared, the past suddenly came back. In 2008, Illinois State Police reopened the investigation. The case was no longer being treated simply as an old file gathering dust. Investigators began taking another look at evidence and statements that had survived from the 1950s, and one of the people who became central to the renewed investigation was Jan Tessier, McCullough's half-sister. Her statements directed investigators back toward her brother. The man who had once been questioned and effectively cleared was suddenly at the center of a new theory. The passage of time made the development even more extraordinary. A case that had begun when Dwight Eisenhower was president was being investigated in an era of modern forensic science. Investigators had tools their predecessors could never have imagined, but modern technology could not automatically solve an old crime. The challenge was still the same. Could the evidence establish what happened on that December night, and could it establish the identity of the person responsible? The reopened investigation created new momentum. Old statements were re-examined. Timelines were reconstructed. The circumstances surrounding McCullough's original alibi were scrutinized. The possibility emerged that the man investigators had dismissed in 1957 might actually have been involved after all. The story was beginning to take a shape that seemed almost too dramatic to be true. An old suspect, a decades-old disappearance, a forgotten investigation, a family statement, and a case that suddenly appeared capable of being solved. But behind every apparent breakthrough was the same dangerous question that had haunted Maria's case from the beginning. What happens when evidence from the past is interpreted through the eyes of the present? The answer would eventually determine whether the reopened investigation represented a genuine breakthrough or another turn in a mystery that had already survived more than half a century. And as investigators moved closer to charging the man once known as John Tessier, the Maria Ridolph case was approaching its most dramatic transformation yet, because after 54 years of silence, the cold case was about to enter a courtroom, and the accusation that had been buried for generations was finally going to be tested in public. For more than half a century, the name of Maria Ridolph remained attached to a mystery that refused to die. But in 2008, the case began moving again, and this time the investigation turned toward a man who had already been questioned during the original search. His name was Jack McCullough, known in 1957 as John Tessier, an 18-year-old who had lived only a few houses from the Ridolph family in Sycamore, Illinois. Decades earlier, investigators had considered him because of his proximity to Maria's home, but his explanation of where he had been on the night she disappeared had taken him out of the center of the investigation. He said he had been in Rockford. He maintained that he had contacted his parents from a post office there. Investigators accepted the account, and his name faded into the background of the case. But 51 years later, That old conclusion was being questioned. Illinois State Police reopened the investigation, and investigators began examining the original evidence with modern eyes. The case had entered a completely different era. The technology was different. The investigative methods were different. But the basic evidence remained what it had always been. Statements made decades earlier, memories that had survived across generations, and documents created when Maria was still alive. One of the most significant developments involved Jan Tessier, McCullough's half-sister. Her statements directed attention toward her brother and caused investigators to reconsider the events surrounding Maria's disappearance. Suddenly, the man who had once been cleared was being looked at again. The development was startling because it challenged a decision made during the original investigation. If McCullough had been involved, then the investigation in 1957 had come dangerously close to the truth without recognizing it. If he had not been involved, then investigators were reopening a devastating old mistake. There was almost no room for uncertainty once the case moved toward prosecution. The allegations were no longer merely part of an investigative file. They were becoming the foundation of a criminal case. In July 2011, McCullough was arrested and charged with Maria's kidnapping and murder. The arrest generated enormous attention. The little girl whose photograph had appeared in newspapers more than 5 decades earlier was suddenly at the center of the national conversation again. For many people, the story seemed to have reached its final stage. A suspect had been identified. Prosecutors had enough evidence to bring charges. A courtroom would finally determine what had happened. But beneath the dramatic headlines was a much more difficult problem. The case depended heavily on evidence that had aged alongside the people connected to it. Memories from 1957 had to be evaluated in the 21st century. Statements had to be compared. Timelines had to be reconstructed, and the defense would have to challenge the prosecution's interpretation of events. McCullough denied killing Maria. His position was clear. He was innocent, and the decades-old allegations did not prove otherwise. The prosecution saw the evidence differently. To them, the reopened investigation had uncovered a credible path connecting McCullough to the crime. The trial would become a confrontation between those competing narratives. The prosecution presented evidence concerning Maria's disappearance and the circumstances surrounding McCullough. Witness testimony became central. The defense attacked the reliability of recollections and questioned whether the evidence could overcome the enormous passage of time. There was something inherently difficult about the proceeding. The crime had occurred in 1957, but the trial was taking place in 2012. More than 50 years separated the event from the courtroom. The jurors and judge were being asked to evaluate what people remembered about an evening that had occurred before many of the participants had even been born. In September 2012, after a bench trial lasting about a week, McCullough was found guilty. The verdict appeared to close the case. The mystery that had survived for more than half a century seemed to have finally been answered. In December, McCullough was sentenced to life in prison. For the Rydolph family, the conviction represented a form of legal accountability after decades of uncertainty. For the community of Sycamore, it seemed that the name of the person responsible had finally been established. Newspapers and broadcasters could now describe the case as solved. But a conviction is not the same thing as historical certainty. The legal process continued. McCullough maintained his innocence and challenged the verdict. And while the appeals process unfolded, another development was quietly taking place that would eventually change the entire story. DeKalb County State's Attorney Richard S.C. H.M.A.C.K. began examining the case. He was not satisfied simply to accept the conviction. He reviewed the massive records surrounding the investigation, including old police files, FBI documents, grand jury material, trial transcripts, affidavits, and other records. The deeper he went, the more complicated the case became. The issue that drew particular attention was McCullough's original alibi. In 1957, he had said he was in Rockford and had contacted his parents from a post office. That detail had been part of the original investigation. But somewhere within the decades of records was documentation that could potentially establish whether the telephone call actually happened and where it came from. The problem was that old records are not always easy to interpret. Telephone systems change. Addresses change. People move. Businesses disappear. Paper records become damaged or forgotten. A document created in 1957 may have little meaning to someone looking at it 60 years later unless the surrounding context is reconstructed carefully. SCHMACK continued reviewing the file. Then, in late 2015, the investigation into the conviction took a dramatic turn. A document was found containing the telephone number associated with the call McCullough had described. That number could be compared with historical FBI information concerning the timing and location of the call. What emerged raised serious questions about the prosecution's case. The records indicated that McCullough's account of being in Rockford was supported by information from the original investigation. The old alibi, once treated as something that could be dismissed or questioned, now appeared far more significant. The discovery was devastating to the conviction because an alibi can change the entire geometry of a crime. If McCullough was actually in Rockford at the relevant time, then the theory that he abducted Maria from Sycamore became extraordinarily difficult to sustain. The case was no longer simply about whether an old witness remembered a man. It was about whether physical records could place the accused somewhere else. And if those records were reliable, then the conviction had a profound problem. Schmack's review continued. The evidence was weighed again. The state had to confront the possibility that a man had been imprisoned for a crime he did not commit. This was not a minor procedural disagreement. This was the kind of discovery that could overturn an entire narrative. The public had been told that the case was solved. Now the official record was beginning to suggest that the apparent solution might have been wrong. In April 2016, McCullough's conviction was vacated and he was released from prison. The moment was extraordinary. A man who had once been sentenced to life for Maria's murder was walking free. The case that had appeared closed was open again. The legal system had effectively returned the investigation to the question it had been trying to answer since 1957. Who killed Maria Ridulph? The reversal also exposed the danger of relying on a single interpretation of old evidence for years. The story had been presented as a dramatic cold case breakthrough, but now the breakthrough itself had collapsed. The investigation had not reached a definitive answer. Instead, it had uncovered another layer of uncertainty. And the most unsettling part was that Maria's killer remained unknown. The reopened case had generated hope that modern investigators could finally provide certainty. Instead, it demonstrated that even modern investigations can become trapped by the limitations of historical evidence. The physical crime scene was long gone. The original witnesses had aged. Some had died. Memories had changed. Records had to be interpreted across generations. And the person who had once been convicted was no longer legally responsible. There was no dramatic DNA match suddenly appearing on a laboratory screen. There was no confession that revealed the hidden truth. There was no final courtroom moment identifying another suspect. What remained was the original mystery. Maria had been taken from a neighborhood street. Her body had been found months later in another part of Illinois. The person responsible had never been conclusively identified. The passage of time had not erased the crime. It had simply made the evidence harder to interpret. And perhaps that is what makes the Maria Ridulph case so disturbing. The investigation has already demonstrated that a cold case can produce a suspect, a prosecution, a conviction, and even a life sentence without producing the truth. The lesson is uncomfortable. A courtroom can establish guilt only when the evidence meets the required legal standard. A newspaper headline can announce a breakthrough in a few words, but neither can change what actually happened. Somewhere between the disappearance in 1957 and the reversal in 2016 lies the answer to one of the most enduring mysteries in Illinois criminal history. Who was the stranger who approached Maria? Was he someone the community knew? Did he deliberately target her? Or did the encounter begin as an opportunity that turned into something far worse? How did Maria travel from Sycamore to the area where her body was found? And most importantly, why has no definitive offender ever been established? These questions remained after McCullough walked out of prison. The case had survived another ending. The supposed solution had failed, and the name Maria Ridulph once again stood alone at the center of an investigation with no final answer. More than 50 years had passed when the case was reopened. Years later, the mystery remained. The files were still there. The memories were still there. The unanswered questions were still there. But the man once convicted was free, and the person who actually killed Maria remained unidentified. The cold case had returned to the darkness from which it had emerged, leaving behind a chilling possibility. Perhaps the truth had been sitting somewhere inside the old evidence all along, waiting for investigators to recognize what they had missed. The conviction had looked like the ending, but in the Maria Ridulph case, the ending was only another beginning, because after more than half a century of uncertainty, the evidence that once seemed to point toward Jack McCullough began pointing in another direction, and the most important clue was not a new witness, not a confession, and not a dramatic forensic discovery, but an old telephone call buried inside a mountain of forgotten records. To understand why that call mattered, investigators had to return to the night of December 20th, 1957, when Maria disappeared from Sycamore, Illinois, and reconstruct the movements of a young man who had lived only a few houses from her family. At the time, McCullough was known as John Tessier. He was 18 years old. He became a person of interest during the original investigation because of his proximity to Maria's home. But he told investigators that he had been in Rockford on the night she disappeared. His account included a detail that seemed ordinary at the time and would later become extraordinarily important. He said he had called his parents from a post office in Rockford. In 1957, a telephone call from a public location could create a record. But that record was not necessarily something investigators could instantly retrieve decades later. There were no digital databases storing every communication. There was no cellular network capable of showing where a person had been. The investigation depended on paper, memories, and whatever records happened to survive. Investigators examined McCullough's story, accepted his alibi, and eventually moved on. The case remained unsolved. Maria's body was found months later, and the investigation became one of the most haunting cold cases in Illinois. For decades, McCullough's name existed in the history of the investigation without becoming the answer. Then the case reopened in 2008. His half-sister Jan Tessier gave statements that caused investigators to look at him again. The old alibi was questioned. The theory that he had been responsible for Maria's disappearance gained new force. In 2011, he was arrested and charged. The prosecution presented the case as a long-delayed pursuit of justice. In 2012, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. To the outside world, the story seemed finished, but the conviction did not erase the question of where McCullough had actually been that night. And that question became more important when Richard Schmack, the DeKalb County State's attorney, began reviewing the case. Schmack's review was extensive. He examined thousands of pages of material accumulated over decades, old police reports, FBI documents, grand jury records, trial transcripts, affidavits, statements, evidence that had been generated at different moments by different investigators. The task was like reconstructing a destroyed machine from scattered pieces. Every document had to be placed into context. Every date mattered. Every time mattered. Every statement had to be compared with what investigators had known at the time. Then came the telephone number. In late 2015, Schmack located a document containing the number associated with the call McCullough said he had made from Rockford. That discovery was potentially explosive because it offered something the prosecution's theory desperately needed to overcome: a contemporaneous record supporting McCullough's claim that he had been somewhere else. The FBI's original records were particularly important. The Bureau had investigated Maria's disappearance during the original search, and its files contained information that had not been adequately appreciated when the later prosecution was built. When the old telephone information was examined more closely, it supported the account that McCullough had given decades earlier. The alibi was not merely a story invented after the fact. There was documentation from the original investigation consistent with his claim. Suddenly, the chronology looked different. If McCullough had been in Rockford when Maria disappeared, then the theory that he had abducted her from Sycamore became impossible or extremely difficult to maintain. The discovery forced investigators and prosecutors to confront an uncomfortable possibility. Had the wrong man been convicted? the answer would have enormous consequences. A conviction that had been celebrated as a cold case breakthrough could become a cautionary example of how an old case can go wrong. The legal system was now faced with evidence that challenged the very foundation of the verdict. The issue was not whether Maria had been murdered. She had. It was not whether someone had taken her from the street. She had disappeared under circumstances that strongly indicated an abduction. The issue was identity. Was Jack McCullough the man who had approached Maria and Kathy? Or had the investigation, after decades of uncertainty, attached the wrong name to the crime? This distinction was critical. In a cold case, the emotional desire for closure can become powerful. Families wait for answers. Communities wait for explanation. Investigators want to know that years of work have produced something meaningful. Prosecutors want to present a coherent theory. The public wants the mystery solved. But evidence does not become stronger simply because everyone wants an ending. In Maria's case, the old records demanded another look. By early 2016, the situation had become impossible to ignore. The state had to consider whether it could continue defending the conviction. The evidence concerning McCullough's alibi was too significant. The original FBI material raised questions that could not be brushed aside. The story that had once seemed simple was becoming complicated again. On April 5, 2016, McCullough's conviction was vacated. He was released from prison. The man who had spent years fighting to prove his innocence was no longer serving a life sentence for Maria's murder. The development was stunning precisely because of how different it was from the story people had been told after the original conviction. The case had gone from cold to solved, from solved to disputed, and from disputed to legally overturned, and Maria's family was left facing a painful reality. The conviction had not produced the certainty they had hoped for. The person responsible for Maria's death remained unknown. The release did not mean that the crime had somehow become less serious. It did not erase the evidence that Maria had been abducted and killed. It simply meant that the state could no longer sustain the conviction against McCullough. The mystery remained intact. Investigators still had to confront the original questions. Who was the man seen with Maria and Kathy? Was the description accurate? Did the killer know Maria beforehand? Did he live nearby? Did he have access to a vehicle? How did he transport Maria from Sycamore to the location where her body was later found? Was the killing planned, or was it an impulsive crime that escalated after the abduction? Every question seemed to lead to another question, and the passing decades made each one harder to answer. The witnesses who had been children in 1957 were now elderly. The investigators who had worked the original case were gone or retired. The physical landscape had changed. The technology that might have solved the case did not exist when Maria disappeared. Yet the records remained. That was the strange power of the telephone evidence. A piece of information created in the 1950s had survived long enough to challenge a conviction in the 21st century. It demonstrated that old cases can contain evidence that has been overlooked, misunderstood, or buried beneath decades of assumptions. The lesson was not simply about McCullough. It was about the entire investigation. For years, the case had been interpreted through different theories. Each generation of investigators inherited the conclusions of the previous generation. Once a suspect becomes central to a case, later investigators can unconsciously interpret evidence through that framework. The danger is obvious. If the original assumption is wrong, every later interpretation can be distorted. The Maria Ridulph investigation became a striking example of that danger. A suspect who had once been cleared returned decades later and was convicted. Then a review of historical records challenged the conviction and brought the case back to its original state. Unresolved. There was no satisfying cinematic ending, no killer standing before cameras, no confession, no definitive forensic match. Instead, there was an empty space where the answer should have been, and that empty space became the most haunting part of the story. Maria was only 7 years old when she disappeared. She should have grown up in the same community where she had played with her friends. She should have gone to school, made friends, experienced ordinary disappointments and ordinary joys, and eventually become an adult. Instead, her life ended before any of those possibilities could happen. Her photograph remained frozen in time while everyone around it aged. The town moved forward, but the mystery remained behind. And now, after the conviction was overturned, The question returned with even greater force. If Jack McCullough was not the killer, then who was? The man who approached Maria had been close enough to speak to her. He had been able to gain her attention. He had been able to separate her from her friend. He had somehow removed her from the neighborhood. Then he disappeared from the story. No confirmed identity, no definitive motive, no final explanation, only the evidence that survived. The telephone call had changed everything because it reminded investigators that the truth of the night could be different from the story that had developed around it. The old records had challenged the modern conviction, but they did not answer the central question. They only eliminated one path, and that left investigators facing the most difficult task in any cold case, starting again without knowing where the truth began. For decades, the Maria Ridulph investigation seemed to exist in two different worlds at the same time. In one world, there was the original crime of 1957, a little girl disappearing from a quiet Illinois neighborhood and later being found dead in a remote area. In the other, there was the modern investigation that reopened the case more than half a century later and eventually produced a conviction that appeared to close the mystery. But between those two worlds was something far more complicated, evidence that had survived for generations, evidence that had been interpreted differently by different investigators, and evidence that ultimately forced authorities to question whether they had convicted the right man. The most unsettling feature of a cold case is that the passage of time can make the evidence seem both more valuable and less reliable at the same moment. A document created on the night of a crime may preserve a detail that no living witness can remember, yet the same document may be incomplete or difficult to interpret. A witness may remember a face for decades, but memories can change. A statement taken immediately after an event may contain information that later recollections do not, and when a case remains unsolved for years, every new theory creates the temptation to look backward and reinterpret the past through that theory. Maria's case became trapped inside that cycle. The original investigation had examined McCullough, then known as John Tessier, and accepted his account that he had been in Rockford. Decades later, investigators returned to him after statements from his half-sister, Jan Tessier. The old case was reconstructed, the accusation gained momentum, and McCullough was eventually convicted. But the later discovery concerning the telephone call demonstrated how dangerous it could be to treat a decades-old conclusion as unquestionable. The historical records had never stopped existing. They had simply remained buried, and somewhere inside those records was information capable of changing the direction of the entire case. When Richard Schmack reviewed the files, he did not simply find another piece of evidence. He found a reason to reconsider the conviction itself. The old telephone information supported McCullough's account of being in Rockford. That did not magically prove every aspect of his story, but it raised a serious question about whether the prosecution had been able to establish his presence in Sycamore at the crucial time. The distinction mattered because the prosecution had to connect a person to the crime, not simply show that the person had once been considered suspicious. The case therefore became a battle over chronology. Where was McCullough? What time was the telephone call? What time did Maria disappear? Could the two events coexist? Could a person physically travel from one place to another within the necessary period? And what did the original investigators actually know? These questions might sound simple, but more than 50 years had passed. Even basic facts could become complicated when records from the 1950s were compared with modern interpretation. The deeper investigators looked, the more they discovered that the original case had never been as straightforward as later headlines suggested. Maria's disappearance itself was clear. Kathy Sigmund had been with her. A man approached them. Maria disappeared. Kathy went home. A search began. Months later, Maria's remains were found. Those facts were the foundation, but everything surrounding them was more uncertain. The description of the man became a critical piece of evidence. Yet descriptions made under stress are not photographs. A frightened child seeing an unfamiliar adult for a brief period may remember certain characteristics clearly while remembering others differently over time. Investigators have to distinguish between what was observed and what was later reconstructed. That problem becomes especially difficult when the witness is repeatedly interviewed and exposed to photographs, names, rumors, and theories. The human mind wants coherence. When confronted with an unexplained event, people naturally try to make the pieces fit. That does not mean a witness is dishonest. It means memory is complicated. In the Maria Ridolph case, the passage of decades made that complication unavoidable. The original witness had been a child. By the time the modern prosecution began, she was an adult carrying memories from a childhood tragedy. The investigation had to ask what remained unchanged and what might have evolved. This was not merely an academic question. The answer could determine whether a man spent the rest of his life in prison. The conviction of McCullough in 2012 therefore carried extraordinary weight. A judge had found him guilty after considering the evidence presented at trial. He received a life sentence. The public could reasonably assume that the mystery had been solved, but the subsequent review demonstrated why legal systems require appeals and why prosecutors have a duty to reconsider convictions when credible new information emerges. Schmack's decision to examine the old records did not weaken the importance of the original crime. It strengthened the obligation to get the identity of the perpetrator right. In April 2016, the conviction was vacated and McCullough was released. The moment shattered the appearance of closure. It also returned attention to the original investigation and the evidence collected in the 1950s. If McCullough had not been responsible, then the killer had escaped identification for more than 50 years. That meant the investigation had to confront the possibility that the real offender had never been properly identified, and that possibility raises another disturbing question. Could the killer have been someone investigators had considered but failed to recognize, or someone they never considered at all? The original investigation was massive by the standards of the era. The FBI was involved. Local authorities searched. Witnesses were interviewed. Tips were investigated, yet the case still failed to produce an offender. The absence of an answer was not caused by a lack of concern. It was caused by the limitations of the evidence. Maria had disappeared in a world without modern forensic databases. Her body was not recovered until months later. The crime scene where she was last seen could not be preserved in the way investigators would preserve a modern homicide scene. Any physical evidence left behind could have been lost, contaminated, or overlooked. Time became the enemy. Every day reduced the chances of finding the person responsible. Every year added another layer of uncertainty. And then the decades began. People who knew Maria grew older. Children who had heard about her became parents and grandparents. The town changed. Yet Maria's story remained part of the community's memory. Her name became synonymous with a case that refused to disappear. When the investigation reopened in 2008, there was a renewed sense that perhaps modern science could accomplish what investigators in 1957 could not. But science can only work with what survives. A laboratory cannot analyze evidence that no longer exists. A database cannot match a biological profile that was never successfully recovered. Technology can transform old cases, but it cannot reverse time. That reality makes the absence of a definitive forensic identification particularly important. Despite the dramatic language often associated with cold case investigations, there was no final DNA discovery that conclusively identified Maria's killer. The most significant turning point came from documents and historical records, not from a spectacular laboratory breakthrough. That distinction matters because the public imagination often expects every old case to end with a dramatic scientific revelation. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it does not. Sometimes the most important discovery is a piece of paper sitting in an archive. In Maria's case, that piece of paper helped undermine a conviction rather than create one. It became evidence that the story might have been wrong. The consequences were enormous. For McCullough, it meant freedom after years in prison. For the Ridolph family, it meant another painful period of uncertainty. For investigators, it meant returning to a case that had already consumed generations. And for the public, it was a reminder that a cold case can produce a false sense of finality. A conviction can feel like closure, but closure and truth are not always the same thing. The legal system had corrected the conviction, but correction did not restore the years lost or answer the question of who had killed Maria. That question remained. The man who approached her remained unidentified. His motive remained unknown. The precise sequence of events after Maria disappeared remained uncertain, and the reason he was able to escape detection for so long remained one of the most troubling mysteries surrounding the case. Perhaps he left the area. Perhaps he lived quietly nearby. Perhaps someone knew something and never spoke. Perhaps the evidence needed to identify him disappeared decades ago. Investigators cannot assume which explanation is correct without evidence. That is, the cruel nature of an unsolved case. Every possibility exists until facts eliminate it. The Maria Ridulph investigation therefore became more than a story about a child murdered in 1957. It became a story about memory, evidence, legal certainty, and the danger of premature closure. The case showed that old evidence can still matter. It showed that an overlooked record can change a verdict. It showed that a conviction can be overturned even after years of legal proceedings. And most painfully, it showed that correcting a wrongful conviction does not necessarily solve the original crime. Maria remained dead. Her killer remained unknown. Her family remained without the definitive answer they had waited decades to receive. The streets where she had once played could never give back what had been taken. The winter night of 1957 could not be reconstructed perfectly, but the records remained, and as long as those records exist, the possibility of another discovery remains. Somewhere in the surviving evidence may be a detail that investigators miss. Somewhere in an old statement may be a contradiction that matters. Somewhere in a forgotten memory may be a name that was never properly followed, and somewhere in the history of Sycamore may still be the answer to the question that has survived for generations. Who took Maria Ridulph? Until that question is answered with evidence strong enough to withstand scrutiny, the case remains what it has always been. A cold case haunted not only by the murder of a child, but by the painful realization that even after a conviction, the truth can still be waiting somewhere in the shadows. The most powerful evidence in a decades-old murder case is often the evidence that survived the longest, but survival does not guarantee certainty, and nowhere was that more apparent than in the Maria Ridulph investigation, where the memory of a child who witnessed the beginning of the tragedy became one of the central elements in a case that would eventually produce a conviction, a life sentence, and then a stunning reversal. Kathy Sigmund was only a child when she stood with Maria on that December evening in 1957. She was not an investigator. She was not trained to identify strangers. She was simply Maria's friend playing outside when a man approached them. Yet her memory became an extraordinary part of the case because she was the last known person to see Maria before the abduction. That meant investigators had to rely on her recollection to understand what happened in those final moments. The stranger spoke to the girls. He interacted with them. He offered them rides on his sled. Then Maria disappeared. Kathy returned home. The search began. What she remembered about that man would remain important for decades. But the passage of time created a problem that no investigator could completely eliminate. Kathy's original memories belonged to a 7-year-old child. Later recollections belonged to an adult who had carried the memory of a traumatic childhood event for more than half a century. Those are not necessarily the same thing. Human memory is not a recording device. It is reconstructed every time a person remembers. Details can remain vivid while other elements change. Faces can become connected with names. Conversations can be remembered differently. Confidence can increase even when accuracy does not. None of this means that a witness is deliberately misleading investigators. It means that investigators must understand the difference between confidence and certainty. That distinction became critical when the case was reopened decades later. Investigators were no longer working only with the original evidence. They were working with the accumulated history of the case. Newspapers had published theory. Names had appeared in public discussions. Investigators had pursued suspects. Families had talked about what they believed happened. The story had been repeated for generations. All of that could potentially influence how an old memory was understood. When Jack McCullough became the focus of the renewed investigation, the question was whether the evidence connecting him to the crime was strong enough to overcome the uncertainty created by time. The prosecution believed it was. The defense did not. The courtroom became the place where those competing interpretations were tested. McCullough had been a young man living near Maria's family in 1957. He had already been questioned during the original investigation. He had already given an account of his whereabouts. He had already been considered and effectively cleared. Yet more than 50 years later, his name returned to the case. The renewed allegations were devastating. Suddenly, the old investigation was being viewed through a completely different lens. What had once been considered an innocent detail could now be interpreted as suspicious. What had once been accepted could now be challenged. The passage of time had transformed the meaning of the evidence. In 2011, McCullough was charged. In 2012, he was convicted. But the conviction did not end the debate. Instead, it intensified it. His defense continued to challenge the case, and eventually the review conducted by DeKalb County State's Attorney Richard Schmack brought attention back to the original records. The telephone call became a crucial issue because it offered a way to test the old alibi against documentary evidence rather than relying entirely on memory. If McCullough had truly been in Rockford, there should have been some evidence capable of supporting that claim. And there was. A surviving document contained the telephone number associated with the call. Historical FBI records provided additional context. The evidence supported his claim that he had been in Rockford. That did not answer every question about the case, but it undermined the idea that his alibi could simply be dismissed. It was a powerful reminder that sometimes the oldest evidence can be more reliable than the memories of people who have spent decades living with the story. A document does not remember. It does not reinterpret. It does not grow older. It simply exists, and investigators must determine what it means. When the records were reconsidered, the legal foundation beneath McCullough's conviction began to weaken. The state ultimately accepted that the conviction could not stand, and in April 2016, it was vacated. McCullough was released. The case returned to uncertainty, but the role of witness memory remained one of the most complicated issues. The original investigation had depended heavily on what Kathy remembered seeing. That was unavoidable. She had been there, but being there did not automatically make every later recollection perfect. Investigators had to ask how the memory had evolved and whether later information had influenced it. This is one of the most difficult problems in cold cases. A witness can be sincere and still be mistaken. A witness can be confident and still be wrong. A witness can remember one detail with extraordinary clarity and another incorrectly. Modern investigators understand this more clearly than investigators did in the 1950s, but understanding the problem does not eliminate it, and in Maria's case, there was another issue: the absence of a definitive physical trace. Maria's remains were discovered months after her disappearance. By then, critical opportunities for evidence collection had been lost. There was no modern crime scene preserved from the moment she vanished. The place where she was last seen had changed. The surrounding environment had changed. People had moved away. Vehicles had disappeared. Objects had been destroyed. Records had been lost. The passage of time had erased much of the physical story. That left investigators with human testimony and historical documents. Those materials could be powerful, but they required interpretation, and interpretation can produce different conclusions. That is precisely what happened in the Maria Ridulph case. One generation of investigators reached one conclusion. Another generation revisited the same history and reached a different conclusion. The result was not a final answer. It was the realization that the earlier answer had been unreliable. That realization may have been painful, but it was necessary. Justice cannot depend on preserving a conclusion simply because it has already been accepted. If new evidence undermines a conviction, the conviction must be reconsidered. In Maria's case, the reconsideration led to McCullough's release, but it also created a new problem. If he was not responsible, then the real offender had remained unidentified for decades. The investigation was back at the beginning, except that many of the people who had been alive in 1957 were now gone. The original witnesses were aged. Investigators who had handled the first search were no longer available to explain their decisions. Documents could tell investigators what had been recorded, but they could not always explain why a decision had been made. This created a kind of investigative archaeology. Every surviving record became a fragment of the past: a name, a telephone number. a statement, a date, a location, a photograph, a newspaper article, a police report. Each fragment had to be examined without assuming that the previous interpretation was correct, and perhaps the most important question was whether there were leads that had never been fully explored. In a case that had received enormous attention, it might seem impossible that a significant lead could have been overlooked. But large investigations generate enormous amounts of information. Tips arrive from people who think they saw something. Rumors spread. False confessions appear. Witnesses remember events differently. Investigators must separate useful information from noise. In 1957, that process was conducted without many of the tools available today. The sheer volume of information could overwhelm investigators. Some leads may have been eliminated correctly, others may have been eliminated too quickly. Some may have disappeared into files, others may have been forgotten. More than half a century later, reconstructing that process was extraordinarily difficult. Yet the unanswered questions demanded that investigators continue trying. Maria's final known moments remained the foundation. She had been outside with Kathy. A man approached. Maria was taken. The offender was able to remove her from the immediate area. Months later, her body was discovered near Woodbine. The distance between those locations meant that the killer had to move her. That required time and opportunity. It also suggested access to transportation. But these were possibilities, not proof. Investigators had to avoid turning logical possibilities into unsupported conclusions. That is one of the central challenges of cold case work. The longer a case remains unsolved, the more tempting it becomes to build a story around gaps in the evidence. But a story is not evidence. A theory is not proof, and a suspicious detail is not a conviction. The Maria Ridulph case demonstrated that distinction painfully. McCullough's conviction had once seemed to provide the final chapter. The later review showed that it did not. What remained was a mystery with a child at its center and a community that had lived with unanswered questions for generations. Maria's family had already endured the worst possible loss. What they needed was not simply a suspect. They needed the truth, and the difference between those two things became painfully clear. A suspect can give a case a name. A conviction can give a case an ending, but only reliable evidence can establish what actually happened. More than 6 decades after Maria vanished, that evidence had still not produced a definitive killer. Her case, therefore, remains a reminder that some mysteries survive not because investigators stop caring, but because time destroys the information needed to provide certainty. Yet the surviving records still matter. The original statements still matter. The FBI files still matter. The historical timeline still matters. And every new examination has the potential to reveal something that earlier investigators did not see. That possibility is the reason cold cases remain alive, not because anyone can promise a dramatic ending, but because the truth may still be hidden inside evidence that has never been fully understood. Maria was 7 years old when she disappeared. More than 60 years have passed since that winter night. The child is gone. The witnesses have aged, and the man responsible has never been conclusively identified. But the question remains as sharp as ever. Who was the stranger standing beside Maria before she vanished? Until that question is answered with evidence that can withstand the same scrutiny that overturned the earlier conviction, the Maria Ridulph case remains unfinished, its most important witness forever connected to a memory that began on a quiet street and ended with one of America's most enduring cold case mysteries. For Maria Ridulph, there was no second chance. For the investigation into her death, there were many. And every time investigators believed they had finally reached the truth, another question appeared behind the answer. That pattern is what transformed the Ridulph case from a tragic murder into one of the most remarkable cold case stories in Illinois history. It began with a child disappearing from an ordinary neighborhood and ended, decades later, with a conviction that was overturned and a killer who remained unidentified. But between those 2 points was a maze of evidence, memories, assumptions, and unanswered questions. And one of the most important lessons was that an old case can be reopened without ever truly being solved. When Maria disappeared in December 1957, the community reacted with urgency. Authorities searched. The Federal Bureau of Investigation became involved. Newspapers followed the story. Maria's photograph became recognizable far beyond Sycamore. Her disappearance created fear because it destroyed the sense of safety that people associated with their neighborhoods. A child had been playing outside. A stranger had approached. Minutes later, she was gone. The circumstances were terrifying precisely because there had been no warning. There was no obvious struggle witnessed by the neighborhood, no dramatic confrontation, no clear explanation. There was only the memory of Kathy Sigmund and the disappearance of her friend. Then, months later, Maria's remains were discovered near Woodbine, Illinois. The investigation changed forever. The search for a missing child became a homicide investigation, and investigators now had to determine not only where Maria had gone, but who had killed her. The location where her body was found was far from the neighborhood where she had disappeared. That geographical separation became one of the enduring mysteries. Someone had moved Maria. Someone had known where to take her. Someone had managed to avoid detection. In 1957, investigators did not have the forensic resources that would later become standard in homicide investigations. The remains had been exposed to the elements for months. The crime scene where Maria was last seen could not be preserved indefinitely. The physical evidence available to investigators was limited. As a result, the case depended heavily on witness accounts and investigative reconstruction. One of the people investigators examined was the young man who lived nearby, John Tessier, later known as Jack McCullough. His proximity to the Ridulph family made him relevant, but his claim that he was in Rockford became a major part of the original investigation. He maintained that he had called his parents from a post office there. Investigators accepted the account, and he was not charged. The case remained unsolved. That fact would become crucial decades later because the same man would eventually return to the center of the investigation. In 2008, Illinois State Police reopened the case. The reopening itself was a major development. Most cold cases remain inactive because investigators have little new information to pursue. But Maria's case had never completely disappeared. The old evidence remained. The memories remained. And new statements created a reason to revisit what had happened. John Tessier, McCullough's half-sister, became important to the renewed investigation. Her statements caused investigators to reconsider her brother's connection to Maria's disappearance. The old alibi was examined again. The case that had been dormant for decades began moving rapidly. In 2011, McCullough was charged with Maria's kidnapping and murder. For the public, the development was extraordinary. A case that had remained unresolved since the 1950s suddenly appeared to have an answer. The suspect was no longer an unidentified stranger. He had a name. He had a history. He had been investigated before, and now prosecutors believed they could prove that he was responsible. The courtroom became the place where the decades-old mystery would be tested. The prosecution presented its evidence. The defense challenged the reliability of the allegations and the interpretation of historical events. The case depended on memories and circumstances separated from the crime by more than half a century. Yet, in September 2012, McCullough was found guilty after a bench trial lasting about a week. He was later sentenced to life in prison for a moment. The case seemed finished. Maria's family had finally heard a verdict. The community finally had a name to attach to the crime. Headlines could describe the case as solved, but the legal story had not ended. McCullough continued to maintain his innocence. His case remained under scrutiny. Then Richard Schmack, the DeKalb County State's attorney, began a detailed review of the prosecution. He went back through thousands of pages of records, looking at evidence that had been generated decades earlier. The review was painstaking because the truth could not be separated from the history of the investigation. What had investigators known in 1957? What had they recorded? What had later investigators believed, and which conclusions had been based on assumptions rather than evidence? The answers began to emerge from old documents. Among the most important was information connected to the telephone call McCullough had described during the original investigation. The call was not merely a claim made years later. There was documentation concerning the number associated with it. When the historical FBI material was examined, the information supported his claim that he had been in Rockford. That was a major problem for the conviction. If the records supported his presence in Rockford during the crucial period, the prosecution's theory connecting him to Maria's disappearance became difficult to sustain. The old alibi had returned from the past with unexpected force, the very detail that had existed in the original investigation but had not prevented the later prosecution from proceeding now became central to the effort to overturn the conviction. It was an extraordinary reversal. In the 1950s, the alibi had helped keep McCullough from becoming the central suspect. In the 21st century, the historical documentation concerning the same alibi helped undermine the conviction. The same case had produced opposite interpretations separated by decades. That is what makes the Rudolph investigation so difficult to understand. It was not simply a matter of one investigator making a mistake. It was the accumulation of assumptions over time. Once a theory becomes accepted, every subsequent piece of information can be unconsciously interpreted through it. The reopening of the case had created a new theory. The conviction seemed to confirm it, but the later record review demonstrated that confirmation was not the same as certainty. In April 2016, McCullough's conviction was vacated and he was released. The moment was a dramatic reversal of the apparent solution. The case was no longer about proving that McCullough was guilty. The question was whether he had ever been the right suspect. The answer from the legal process was clear enough. The conviction could not stand, but that did not mean investigators had discovered the real killer. Instead, the case returned to the uncertainty that had defined it for generations. Maria's killer remained unidentified. The reversal created a new kind of frustration. Families of victims often wait for years hoping that a cold case will be solved. When a conviction finally arrives, the emotional impact can be enormous. But when that conviction is later overturned, the family must endure another form of uncertainty. The name that once represented closure is removed. The case becomes open again. The questions return, and time has made them harder to answer. By then, more than 58 years had passed since Maria's disappearance. The people who had investigated the crime in 1957 were mostly gone. The people who had witnessed the original search had grown old. The physical environment had changed. The records were aging. The original evidence was no longer easily accessible or, in some cases, capable of being re-examined with modern technique. The investigation had become an archaeological excavation of memory and paper, yet the possibility of new information remained. Cold cases sometimes survive because a forgotten document is discovered. Sometimes a witness comes forward. Sometimes technology makes old biological evidence useful. Sometimes a contradiction that seemed insignificant decades earlier becomes important when viewed through modern investigative method. But in Maria's case, there was no publicly established forensic breakthrough that definitively identified her killer. The dramatic turning point came from historical documentation that challenged the conviction. That distinction matters. It means the story cannot honestly end with a claim that modern DNA technology finally revealed the murderer. It did not. The murderer remained unknown, and that uncertainty is part of the historical record. The case also illustrates how difficult it is to reconstruct a crime when the original evidence was collected under the limitations of another era. Modern investigators are accustomed to thinking in terms of digital records, surveillance footage, cellular data, forensic databases, and advanced DNA analysis. None of those tools were available in the form they exist today. The investigation had to rely on what people saw and what they remembered. That made the case vulnerable to the limitations of human memory. The witness was a child. The suspect was a teenager. The investigators were working without modern technology, and the crime itself occurred in an environment where children commonly moved through neighborhoods without constant adult supervision. The offender needed only a brief opportunity. That may have been enough. More than 6 decades later, the question remains whether the man who approached Maria was known to her family, or simply a stranger who happened to appear at exactly the wrong moment. There is no definitive answer. What is known is that Maria disappeared. Her body was found months later, and no final judicial determination has established the identity of the person responsible. The conviction of McCullough did not survive scrutiny. His release did not solve the case. The historical records corrected one part of the story, but left the central mystery untouched. That is why Maria Ridulph's name continues to appear whenever investigators and journalists discuss America's enduring cold cases. The case represents the difference between finding a suspect and finding the truth. It represents the danger of premature closure, and it represents the painful reality that some investigations can consume generations without producing a final answer. Maria's story began on a winter street in Sycamore. It passed through police stations, newspapers, FBI files, courtrooms, and prison walls. It crossed from the 1950s into the 21st century. It produced a conviction and then lost it. And through every stage, one fact remained unchanged. A 7-year-old girl was taken, murdered, and left behind in a place far from home. Whoever did it escaped definitive identification. The case refused to stay closed because the truth had never truly been established. And until the evidence finally reveals who was responsible, Maria Ridulph's disappearance remains an unfinished story, preserved in old files and fading memory, waiting for the one piece of evidence capable of transforming decades of uncertainty into an answer. There was one fact that made the Maria Ridulph investigation especially disturbing from the beginning. The place where Maria disappeared was not the place where she was eventually found. Between those two locations was a journey that investigators could never completely reconstruct, a hidden sequence of movements that occurred after a little girl vanished from a familiar neighborhood and before her remains were discovered months later. That distance became one of the most important unanswered questions in the entire case because whoever was responsible had somehow taken Maria away from Sycamore and transported her to a remote area near Woodbine, Illinois. The offender had not simply disappeared into the night. He had moved through the world with Maria, and somehow no one had been able to provide a definitive account of that journey. On the evening of December 20th, 1957, Maria had been outside with Kathy Sigmund. They were children doing something ordinary in their neighborhood. Then a man approached. Kathy later described the encounter, including the man's interaction with the girls and his offer of rides on his sled. It was the kind of brief encounter that could easily have seemed harmless to a child until the moment Maria disappeared. The transition from ordinary play to abduction was frighteningly fast. Kathy went home, and the alarm began. Adults searched the neighborhood. Authorities were contacted. The possibility that Maria had simply wandered away was quickly overwhelmed by the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. She had been with another child. A stranger had been present. Then Maria was gone. The search expanded rapidly, but the night itself provided few answers. Investigators did not know where Maria had been taken. They did not know whether the offender had been waiting nearby. They did not know whether he had approached the girls by chance. They did not know whether he knew Maria personally, and they did not know how far he intended to travel. The discovery of Maria's remains in April 1958 provided the first major geographical clue. She was found near Woodbine, roughly 20 miles east of Galena, a significant distance from Sycamore. The discovery forced investigators to confront the possibility that transportation had played a central role in the crime. Someone had moved Maria from the place where she disappeared to the place where she was eventually found. That immediately created a new set of questions. What route had been used? Was the offender familiar with the area? Did he have access to a car? Had anyone seen a vehicle behaving suspiciously? Did the offender know the wooded location where Maria was left? Was the location selected deliberately, or was it simply a place where the killer believed the body would remain undiscovered? These questions might appear straightforward today, but in 1958, investigators did not have the tools that modern detectives could use to reconstruct a vehicle's movements. There were no cellular records, no automated camera, no digital maps recording traffic patterns, no GPS devices, no widespread surveillance system. A journey could vanish almost completely if no one witnessed it. Even if a person drove through a town on a particular night, investigators might have no surviving evidence proving it. Roads were different. Businesses changed. Vehicles changed. People forgot. And the further investigators moved from the original crime scene, the more uncertain the reconstruction became. The location where Maria was found nevertheless told investigators something important. The killer had managed to separate the crime from the place where it began. That separation may have helped the offender escape detection. Sycamore was where the disappearance occurred. The remote area near Woodbine became the place where the crime ended. Between them was a corridor of roads, towns, and opportunities for the offender to disappear. If the killer lived locally, he may have known which roads were quiet. If he came from elsewhere, he may have known the area for another reason. But without evidence, those possibilities could not become conclusions. The investigation, therefore, returned again to the people who had been near Maria when she vanished. One of the most important figures remained Jack McCullough, who had been 18 years old in 1957 and lived close to the Rydolph family. His original account placed him in Rockford. Decades later, investigators questioned that account and eventually prosecuted him. His conviction in 2012 seemed to provide an explanation for the journey, but when the old records were reviewed, the telephone evidence supporting his Rockford alibi became central. The conviction was overturned in 2016, and McCullough was released. That reversal meant investigators once again had to look at the journey without the assumption that McCullough had made it. The question of transportation became even more important because if the wrong man had been identified, then someone else had completed that journey. Somewhere, another person had taken Maria from Sycamore. Somewhere, another person had transported her. Somewhere, another person had selected the place where her body was eventually discovered. That person had never been conclusively identified. The uncertainty is amplified by the condition of the remains when they were found. Several months had passed. The environment had changed. Evidence that might have existed immediately after the murder could have disappeared. Whether animals and natural decomposition can destroy information that investigators desperately need. In modern homicide investigations, preserving a crime scene can produce an enormous amount of evidence. In 1957 and 1958, investigators had far fewer methods for extracting information from a scene that had been exposed for months. The physical evidence was therefore limited by both technology and time, yet the location itself remained significant. Why that place? Why Woodbine? Why that particular area? Was it chosen because the killer knew it? Was it isolated enough to seem safe? Was the offender traveling through the region? Was Maria taken there immediately after the abduction? Or later? Every possibility creates another branch in the investigation. A cold case becomes difficult when too many branches remain open and too little evidence exists to eliminate them. The investigation also had to contend with the possibility of coincidence. Not every person who appeared suspicious was necessarily connected to Maria's murder. Not every unexplained movement was evidence of guilt. Not every rumor deserved to become a lead. Investigators had to separate genuine information from the noise that surrounds a famous unsolved case. The FBI's involvement meant the investigation was substantial, but even a major investigation can fail when the available evidence is limited. The passage of time eventually magnified the problem. Witnesses who might have remembered vehicles or people in the area were no longer available. Memories faded. Some records disappeared. People who had been questioned in the 1950s might not remember precisely what they had told investigators decades earlier. Others might remember the case only through newspaper coverage rather than personal observation. The original investigation had therefore become difficult to reconstruct, even for those who wanted to reopen it. And yet, the story never completely disappeared. Maria's name remained. The photographs remained. The case files remained. The conviction of McCullough briefly created the illusion that the journey had finally been explained. Then the conviction was overturned, and the mystery returned. That reversal also changed how the public could understand the case. It was no longer enough to ask whether McCullough was guilty. The larger question became whether the original investigation had overlooked someone else. If so, who? The answer could potentially be hidden in the same evidence investigators had examined for decades. Perhaps an old witness had described a vehicle that was never properly traced. Perhaps a statement contained a detail that seemed unimportant at the time. Perhaps someone had provided information that was never followed. Or perhaps the evidence needed to solve the case had simply vanished. The most difficult possibility is that the offender's identity was never recorded in any surviving document. A person could commit a crime and leave almost no trace in the historical record. In 1957, that possibility was far greater than it is today. A person could travel without leaving a digital trail. A vehicle could pass through a town without being recorded. A telephone call could leave only limited information. A stranger could interact with a child without appearing in any database. The world itself was less documented. That reality makes Maria's case especially haunting. The killer did not have to defeat modern surveillance. He only had to disappear into a world where evidence was scarce. And once decades passed, the challenge became even greater. Every year reduced the possibility that someone could provide a fresh eyewitness account. People died. Memories faded. Physical evidence degraded. The investigation became dependent on the fragments left behind, but those fragments still tell a story. They tell us that Maria was taken from Sycamore. They tell us that her remains were found near Woodbine months later. They tell us that an extensive investigation followed. They tell us that a man once considered a suspect was later convicted and then released after his conviction was vacated. And they tell us that the identity of Maria's killer has never been conclusively established. That is the point at which the case becomes more than an old murder story. It becomes a question about whether the past can ever be reconstructed completely. Investigators can revisit documents. They can compare statements. They can search for surviving evidence. But they cannot recreate the December night exactly as it happened. No camera can suddenly appear on that street. No modern database can reproduce every vehicle that passed through the area. No witness can become young again and observe the scene for the first time. The past is fixed, but our understanding of it is not. That is why cold cases can change without the underlying facts changing. New investigators ask different questions. Old records are interpreted differently. A forgotten detail becomes significant. An alibi once accepted may later become central. A conviction may be overturned, yet the original event remains frozen in time. Maria was still 7 years old. She was still outside with her friend. A man still approached. She was still taken. Her remains were still discovered months later, and the person responsible still has not been definitively named. The road from Sycamore to the place where Maria was found therefore remains more than a geographical distance. It represents the missing section of the story. Investigators know where the story began. They know where it ended. What they do not know with certainty is everything that happened between those points. Somewhere along that hidden road lies the truth, and until investigators can reconstruct that journey with evidence strong enough to identify the person responsible, Maria Ridolf's case will remain suspended between two places, two moments, and one question that has survived for generations. Who took her, and how did that person disappear without leaving behind the answer? The most shocking moment in the Maria Ridolf case did not come when investigators announced an arrest. It came years later when the conviction that had appeared to close one of America's oldest child murder mysteries began to collapse under the weight of evidence from the past. For decades, people had waited for a name. When Jack McCullough was convicted in 2012, that name seemed to have arrived. But a conviction is supposed to represent the conclusion of an evidentiary process, not the beginning of a new investigation into whether the wrong person had been convicted. In Maria's case, that distinction became impossible to ignore. The story of McCullough's conviction began with a reopened investigation more than 50 years after Maria disappeared. In 2008, Illinois State Police returned to the case and began examining evidence that had survived from the 1950s. The renewed investigation focused attention on McCullough, who had been 18 years old and known as John Tessier when Maria disappeared. He had lived only a few houses away from the Ridolf family. During the original investigation, authorities had questioned him. His explanation was that he had been in Rockford on the night Maria vanished. He said he had contacted his parents from a post office there. Investigators accepted his account, and he was not charged. For decades, that was where the matter stood. Then new statements brought his name back into the investigation. John Tessier, McCullough's half-sister, became an important figure in the renewed case. Her statements caused investigators to reconsider what they believed they knew about her brother's movements and his possible connection to Maria. The old alibi was examined again. The possibility emerged that the young man investigators had once dismissed might have been the person who approached Maria and Kathy that December evening. In July 2011, McCullough was arrested and charged with Maria's kidnapping and murder. The arrest was dramatic because it appeared to transform a historical mystery into a modern prosecution. A man who had been questioned decades earlier was suddenly facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. The case attracted renewed public attention. For many observers, the story seemed almost unbelievable. A child had disappeared in 1957. More than 50 years later, investigators had apparently found the person responsible. The courtroom would now determine whether the evidence could support that conclusion. The trial took place in 2012. The prosecution presented evidence connecting McCullough to the crime. The defense challenged the allegations and the reliability of evidence separated from the murder by more than half a century. The passage of time was not a minor detail. It was one of the central problems. People who had witnessed the events were much older. Documents had to be interpreted in light of decades of history. Memories had been carried through an entire lifetime. Yet after a bench trial lasting about a week, McCullough was found guilty. In December, he received a life sentence. The legal system had apparently delivered the answer the community had waited for. The case could finally be described as solved. Maria's family had a verdict. Investigators had a suspect. The public had a name, but McCullough continued to deny responsibility. And then another investigation began, this time into the conviction itself. Richard S. Schmack, the DeKalb County State's attorney, began reviewing the extensive case record. His review was not superficial. He examined thousands of pages of documents accumulated over many years. The goal was to understand what the original investigators had known, what later prosecutors had presented, and whether the conviction remained supported when all the historical information was considered. The review uncovered a critical issue involving McCullough's original alibi. The telephone call he had described from Rockford became central. Investigators located a document containing the telephone number connected to the call. Historical FBI material provided additional information. The old records supported McCullough's account that he had been in Rockford. This was not a new story invented after his conviction. It was information that had existed in the original investigative record. That changed the significance of the alibi. If McCullough had actually been in Rockford at the relevant time, then the prosecution's theory of his involvement became deeply problematic. The question was no longer whether his story sounded believable. There was documentary evidence supporting it. The case had turned into a conflict between a modern theory and historical records from the original investigation. The discovery was devastating because it demonstrated how an old case can be distorted by the passage of time. Investigators in the 21st century had been trying to solve a mystery that investigators in the 1950s had never solved. But the modern investigation did not necessarily have more information. In some ways, it had less context. The people who had created the original records were no longer available to explain them. The significance of the old telephone information had to be rediscovered. And once it was rediscovered, the entire conviction had to be reconsidered. This is one of the most uncomfortable realities of cold case investigation. Time can create the illusion that modern investigators are automatically closer to the truth because they have better technology. But technology cannot compensate for missing context. A modern investigator may have tools capable of analyzing evidence at a level unimaginable in 1957, yet still misunderstand an old document because the original circumstances have been forgotten. The Maria Ridolph case demonstrated that problem with extraordinary clarity. The telephone evidence was not spectacular in appearance. There was no dramatic laboratory image. No mysterious fingerprint suddenly appeared. No anonymous confession arrived. There was a number in an old record, but that number had the power to change a man's life and reopen a murder investigation. As the review continued, the state's position became increasingly difficult to defend. The old records raised serious doubts about whether McCullough could have committed the crime as alleged. In April 2016, his conviction was vacated, and he was released from prison. The reversal was stunning. A man who had been sentenced to life for Maria's murder was suddenly free. The case that had been presented as solved was once again unresolved. For the public, this created an uncomfortable contradiction. How could a case that had produced a conviction still be unsolved? The answer was that the conviction had not survived scrutiny. The legal system had determined that it could not stand. That did not mean the murder had disappeared. It meant the identity of the person responsible remained uncertain. Maria still needed the truth. Her family still had unanswered questions, and investigators were once again forced to confront the possibility that the real killer had never been identified. The reversal also changed the way people viewed the original investigation. If McCullough was not responsible, then what had happened to the original evidence? Why had he become the focus of the reopened case? How had the theory developed? Why did the evidence supporting his alibi not prevent the conviction? These questions became almost as important as the original mystery because they revealed how complicated a cold case can become after decades of reinterpretation. A case can accumulate layers of assumptions. One investigator sees a detail, another investigator interprets it. A third investigator reads the second investigator's conclusion rather than the original evidence. Eventually, the conclusion can become part of the case itself. The line between evidence and interpretation becomes blurred. Maria's investigation demonstrated how dangerous that can be. The original investigation had one conclusion. The reopened investigation had another. The later review challenged the second conclusion. 3 different stages of the same case produced dramatically different understandings of the same historical events. That does not mean every investigator acted improperly. It means that the evidence was difficult and incomplete. Cold cases are vulnerable to uncertainty because the passage of time creates enormous gaps. When investigators attempt to fill those gaps, they must resist the temptation to treat assumptions as facts. The Maria Ridulph case shows while a suspect can look convincing, a theory can appear logical, a courtroom can produce a verdict, and yet the truth can remain elsewhere. The most important question after McCullough's release was therefore not whether the case had failed. It was where the investigation should go next. If the convicted man was no longer the answer, investigators needed to reconsider the original evidence without him at the center. They had to return to Maria's final known moments. They had to return to Kathy Sigmund's memory. They had to return to the physical locations. They had to examine the old files again. And they had to ask whether someone else had been overlooked. But every year that passed made that task more difficult. By 2016, almost 6 decades had passed since Maria vanished. Many potential witnesses were gone. Memories were increasingly distant. Physical evidence had deteriorated or disappeared. The world itself had changed. The streets of Sycamore were no longer exactly as they had been in 1957. Roads had changed. Buildings had changed. Communities had changed. Yet Maria's disappearance remained frozen in the historical record. Her photograph still showed the same child who had walked outside that December evening. The passage of time had no power to alter the moment she vanished. It only altered the ability of investigators to reconstruct it. That is why the collapse of McCullough's conviction was both a legal correction and a tragedy. It corrected the record by removing a conviction that could not be sustained, but it also revealed that the original murder remained unsolved. The person responsible had gained another advantage from time. Every year without identification reduced the likelihood that a living witness could provide decisive information. Every year increased the chance that physical evidence would become unusable. Every year made the original crime more distant. Yet the case remained alive because Maria's name remained alive. The investigation could be revisited. Records could still be examined. Historical evidence could still be compared. And the possibility of another breakthrough could never be completely eliminated. But any future breakthrough would need to meet a higher standard than the failed conviction. It would need to establish the truth rather than simply create another compelling theory. It would need evidence capable of surviving scrutiny decades later. And until that happens, the Maria Ridulph case cannot honestly be described as solved. The most dramatic revelation in the modern history of the case was not the discovery of a killer. It was the discovery that the apparent solution was not reliable. A man once convicted was released. The murder remained unresolved. And the question that began on a December night in 1957 returned to the center of the investigation. Who was the man who approached Maria? Who took her away from that street? Who transported her to the place where she was found? Who knew where to leave her? Who disappeared afterward without giving investigators the final piece of the puzzle? More than 60 years later, those questions remain. And that is the part of the story that no headline can make disappear. The conviction was overturned. The suspect walked free, but Maria's killer was still somewhere beyond the reach of the evidence, leaving behind a cold case that had survived one of the most extraordinary reversals imaginable. 60 years can erase almost everything except a question. Buildings disappear. Roads are rebuilt. People move away. Witnesses grow old. Investigators retire. Files gather dust. Memories become fragments, but one question can survive all of it, repeated from one generation to the next with the same painful simplicity. Who killed Maria Ridolf? She was 7 years old when she disappeared from Sycamore, Illinois on December 20th, 1957. She had been outside with her friend Kathy Sigmund when a man approached them. He spoke to the girls. He interacted with them. He offered rides on his sled. Then Maria was gone. That single moment created a mystery that would survive longer than the childhood of the girl who witnessed it, longer than the careers of the investigators who searched for Maria, and longer than the lives of many of the people who first heard her name. The first investigation was enormous for its time. Authorities searched for Maria. The Federal Bureau of Investigation became involved. Newspapers carried her photograph and details of the disappearance. People across Illinois learned that a child had vanished from a seemingly ordinary neighborhood. The fear was immediate because the crime appeared to have happened in a place where families believed their children were safe. The circumstances were especially disturbing because Maria had not disappeared while traveling across the country or wandering through an unfamiliar city. She disappeared close to home. A man had approached 2 children, and within moments, one of them was gone. The investigation therefore focused heavily on identifying the man, but the information available was limited. The only eyewitness to the encounter was a child. There were no modern surveillance systems. There was no digital record of every movement. There was no cellular data. Investigators had to work with what people remembered and what records they could obtain. One of the young men examined was John Tessier, later known as Jack McCullough. He lived close to the Ridolf family and was 18 years old at the time. His proximity made him a logical person for investigators to question, but he told authorities he had been in Rockford on the night Maria disappeared and had contacted his parents from a post office. The original investigation accepted his explanation. He was not charged. The case continued without a definitive suspect. Then Maria's remains were discovered months later near Woodbine, Illinois, roughly 20 miles east of Galena. The discovery transformed the investigation. The search for a missing child had become a murder investigation, but the physical evidence was limited by the passage of time. Maria's remains had been exposed for months, making forensic reconstruction difficult. Investigators concluded that her death was consistent with suffocation and/or strangulation, but the scientific tools available in 1958 could not produce the kind of detailed evidence modern investigators might expect. The crime scene itself had not been preserved in the way a modern homicide scene would be. Every day between the disappearance and the discovery of the body reduced the amount of usable information. Yet the investigation continued. The years did not produce a definitive answer. Instead, the case became part of the permanent memory of Sycamore. Maria's name remained associated with a crime that had never been solved. Then, more than 50 years later, something changed. In 2008, Illinois State Police reopened the case. The investigation returned to the old evidence. Investigators examined statements and reconsidered people who had been connected to the original investigation. Among them was Jack McCullough. His half-sister, Jan Tessier, provided statements that caused investigators to focus on him again. The old alibi was questioned. The theory that McCullough might have been responsible became the central direction of the renewed investigation. The development was extraordinary because McCullough had already been investigated in 1957. Decades earlier, authorities had accepted his explanation. Now, more than half a century later, he was being treated as the possible killer. In July 2011, he was charged with Maria's kidnapping and murder. The case became one of the most remarkable cold case prosecutions in the country. The age of the crime made the prosecution unusual. The evidence had to survive more than 50 years of time, memory, and changing circumstances. Yet prosecutors believed the case was strong enough to proceed. In 2012, McCullough was found guilty after a bench trial lasting about a week. He was later sentenced to life in prison for a moment. The question seemed to have an answer. The case that had begun in the Eisenhower era had finally reached a verdict in the modern era. Maria's family had a name. The community had a conclusion. The cold case appeared solved, but the story did not end in the courtroom. McCullough continued to deny responsibility. His case remained under review. Then Richard Schmack, the DeKalb County State's attorney, began examining the conviction. He reviewed thousands of pages of records. His work focused on what had actually been known in the original investigation and whether the later prosecution had properly accounted for that evidence. The review eventually uncovered information concerning the telephone call McCullough had said he made from Rockford. A document containing the telephone number was found. Historical FBI material supported the account that he had been in Rockford. The discovery became crucial because it directly challenged the prosecution's theory of the crime. If McCullough was in Rockford during the relevant period, then his ability to have committed the abduction in Sycamore became a serious issue. The old alibi, which had once seemed like a routine investigative detail, had become a central piece of evidence. And suddenly the case looked completely different. The same man who had been presented as the solution was now at the center of a potential wrongful conviction. In April 2016, McCullough's conviction was vacated and he was released. The reversal sent the case back into uncertainty. The murder was still real. Maria was still dead. But the person responsible was still unknown. That distinction is crucial. A conviction being overturned does not automatically identify another offender. It simply means the existing conviction cannot stand. The investigation must then return to the evidence and begin asking questions again. The Maria Ridulph case therefore entered another phase of uncertainty. Investigators had to separate what was known from what had been assumed. They had to examine the original evidence without allowing the overturned conviction to dominate their thinking. They had to reconsider the witness account. They had to reconstruct the timeline. They had to understand what happened between the moment Maria disappeared and the moment her remains were discovered months later. But time had created an enormous obstacle. The original witnesses had aged. Some were no longer alive. Investigators who had worked the case in the 1950s could no longer explain what they had seen. Documents were available, but documents cannot answer questions they were never designed to answer. A police report can tell investigators what someone said. It cannot necessarily tell them whether that person was correct. A telephone record can establish that a call occurred. It cannot automatically explain every movement of the person who made it. Evidence has boundaries, and the further investigators move from the original event, the more important those boundaries become. That is why the Maria Ridulph investigation cannot be reduced to a simple story about an old suspect and a modern exoneration. It is a story about uncertainty itself. The case demonstrates how a theory can become powerful when investigators desperately want to explain an unsolved crime. It demonstrates how a conviction can create the appearance of closure, and it demonstrates how historical records can later force authorities to question that closure. The most important discovery of the modern investigation was not the identity of a killer. It was the realization that the previous answer could not be trusted. That realization was painful, but it was necessary. Maria deserved a truthful answer, not simply a convenient one. Her family deserved evidence, not speculation. And the justice system had to distinguish between what could be proven and what people believed had happened. The case also illustrates the limits of modern forensic technology. Cold cases are often associated with DNA, genetic genealogy, and spectacular laboratory breakthroughs. But not every case contains usable biological evidence. The fact that technology has advanced does not mean that every old murder can suddenly be solved. Evidence can be destroyed. Biological material can degrade. Crime scenes can disappear. Records can be lost. Witnesses can die. In Maria's case, there has been no publicly established DNA breakthrough conclusively identifying her killer. The central mystery remains a question of historical evidence and investigative reconstruction. That makes the case more frustrating because there is no obvious technological button investigators can press to produce the answer. The truth may depend on evidence that is already somewhere in the surviving record. A forgotten document, an overlooked statement, a contradiction, a name, a connection that previous investigators did not recognize. Cold case investigations often turn on details that initially appear insignificant. The telephone evidence that changed the McCullough case is an example of how something created decades earlier can suddenly become decisive when examined in a new context. It raises the possibility that other evidence from the Maria Ridulph investigation may still contain information that has never been fully understood. But possibilities are not answers. Until investigators can connect evidence to a specific person beyond reasonable doubt, the identity of the killer remains unresolved. That is the difference between a mystery and a conclusion. The Maria Ridulph case has produced many theories. It has produced a conviction. It has produced an overturned conviction. It has produced years of investigative work. But it has not produced the final answer. More than 60 years after Maria disappeared, the most important questions remain almost exactly where they were at the beginning. Who was the man who approached the girls? Why did he choose Maria? Did he know her? How did he move her from Sycamore? Why was she taken to the area near Woodbine? What happened during the hours between her disappearance and her death? And how did the offender remain unidentified for so long? Each question points toward a larger mystery. Each unanswered detail represents another gap in the historical record, and those gaps are precisely where a killer can disappear. Maria's story is therefore not only about what happened to a child, it is about what happens when the passage of time separates investigators from the evidence they need. The case survived because people refused to forget her. But memory alone cannot solve a homicide. It can preserve the questions, it can preserve the names, it can preserve the photographs and the stories. But ultimately, justice requires evidence. Somewhere in the surviving history of Maria Ridulph may still be the evidence capable of answering the question. Until that evidence emerges, the case remains open in the only way that matters. The truth has not yet been established. The conviction that once promised closure is gone. The man once imprisoned for Maria's murder is free, and the real killer remains unidentified. 60 years have passed, but the silence surrounding Maria's final moments has never been broken. Her name still leads investigators back to that winter evening in 1957, back to the quiet street, back to the child standing beside her friend, and back to the stranger whose identity remains hidden. The case has survived because the question has survived. And as long as that question remains unanswered, the story of Maria Ridulph is not a solved case from the past. It is a cold case still waiting for the truth. More than 6 decades after Maria Ridulph vanished, the most disturbing fact about the case is not how much investigators have learned, but how much remains impossible to prove. The crime began on a winter evening in 1957, yet its consequences continued through generations of investigators, prosecutors, witnesses, and family members. People who had been children when Maria disappeared became grandparents. Officers who had once walked the streets searching for her were gone. The original records became historical documents. The courtroom that once seemed to deliver the final answer became part of the mystery itself. And through all of it, the identity of the person who killed Maria remained uncertain. That uncertainty begins with the final ordinary moments before she vanished. Maria was 7 years old. She was outside with her friend Kathy Sigmund near her home in Sycamore, Illinois. It was December 20th, 1957. The evening was cold, and the girls were playing together when a man approached them. Kathy later remembered the stranger interacting with them and offering rides on his sled. Nothing about the encounter initially appeared to signal what was about to happen. Then, Maria disappeared. Kathy returned home. Adults became involved. The search began. Within hours, the neighborhood was transformed. People were looking down streets, checking surrounding areas, and trying to determine where a 7-year-old child could have gone. The possibility of an abduction became increasingly obvious. Investigators needed a description of the man. They needed to know whether anyone else had seen him. They needed to understand how Maria could have been taken without someone immediately stopping the offender. They also needed to determine whether the stranger was actually a stranger. That question would remain at the heart of the case. Did Maria know him? Did he know her? Had he been watching her? Or was the encounter random? There were no easy answers. The investigation expanded. The Federal Bureau of Investigation became involved. The case received national attention. Maria's photograph appeared in newspapers and on missing child notices. Her disappearance became one of the most widely remembered crimes in the region. But publicity could not manufacture evidence. Leads came in. Investigators pursued them, yet none produced a definitive offender. Then, in April 1958, Maria's remains were discovered near Woodbine, Illinois, roughly 20 miles east of Galena. The discovery brought the missing child case to its most devastating conclusion. Maria had not simply disappeared. She had been killed. Investigators examined the remains, but the condition of the body after months of exposure limited what could be determined. Authorities concluded that the death was consistent with suffocation and/or strangulation, yet there was no modern DNA technology available to identify an unknown offender. There was no national genetic database. There was no digital crime scene. The investigation had to work within the limitations of the era. Those limitations would eventually become part of the reason the case survived for so long. Investigators examined people connected to the area, including John Tessier, the young man who lived close to the Ridulph family and would later become known as Jack McCullough. His proximity made him a logical person to question, but his account placed him in Rockford. He said he had contacted his parents from a post office there. The original investigation accepted his alibi, and he was not charged. The case remained unsolved. For decades, that decision became part of the historical record. Then time moved forward. In 2008, Illinois State Police reopened the case. The old investigation was no longer being treated as a closed chapter. New statements and renewed attention brought McCullough back into focus. His half-sister Jan Tessier provided information that directed investigators toward him. The old alibi was reconsidered. The possibility that the man once cleared had actually been responsible became the central theory of the reopened investigation. In July 2011, McCullough was charged with kidnapping and murdering Maria. Suddenly, the case that had been silent for decades was everywhere again. The story was extraordinary enough to dominate headlines. A 7-year-old girl murdered in the 1950s, a suspect identified more than 50 years later, and a courtroom finally prepared to examine the evidence. For many people, the arrest felt like the ending they had been waiting for. But the legal process would reveal just how complicated the past could become. McCullough maintained his innocence. Prosecutors presented their evidence. The defense challenged the interpretation of historical testimony and events. The case relied heavily on evidence separated from the crime by more than 50 years. Yet in September 2012, McCullough was found guilty after a bench trial lasting about a week. In December, he was sentenced to life in prison. The verdict created a powerful sense of closure. Maria had a killer, or so it appeared, but the story was not finished. McCullough's legal challenges continued, and the conviction eventually attracted the attention of DeKalb County State's Attorney Richard Schmack, undertook a detailed review of the case, examining thousands of pages of records. He looked beyond the narrative that had produced the conviction and returned to the original evidence. That meant examining what investigators in 1957 had known about McCullough's movements. It meant asking whether the original alibi had been properly understood, and it meant looking carefully at the records surrounding the telephone call McCullough said he had made from Rockford. Then came the discovery that changed the case again. A document containing the telephone number associated with the call was located. Historical FBI records provided additional context, and the information supported McCullough's claim that he had been in Rockford. Suddenly, the old alibi was no longer simply a statement made by a suspect. It was supported by surviving documentation that raised serious doubts about the conviction. If McCullough had been in Rockford at the relevant time, then the theory that he had abducted Maria from Sycamore became extremely difficult to maintain. The state could no longer ignore the possibility that the wrong man had been convicted. In April 2016, McCullough's conviction was vacated, and he was released. The reversal transformed the story once again. The man once presented as the solution was no longer legally responsible for the murder. The case had returned to uncertainty. But uncertainty does not mean nothing is known. Investigators still knew Maria had been abducted. They knew she had been found dead months later. They knew she had been moved from Sycamore to the area near Woodbine. They knew the original investigation had been extensive. They knew McCullough had been investigated and later convicted before that conviction was overturned. And they knew that the historical evidence had exposed weaknesses in the later prosecution. What they did not know was who had actually committed the crime. That distinction became increasingly important as the years passed. In public discussions, the case could easily become distorted into a story about an exonerated suspect or a failed prosecution, but at its core, it remained the story of a child whose life ended violently and whose killer had not been definitively identified. The unanswered questions were still the same. What did the man who approached Maria really look like? Was the description accurate? Did he know Maria? How did he convince her to leave? Where did he take her immediately afterward? What route did he use? Why did he choose the location where her body was found? Did he act alone? Did anyone know what he had done? And why did the evidence never lead investigators to a final answer? Each question carries the weight of more than 60 years. The passage of time has made the answers harder to find, but it has also made the surviving evidence more important. Old records can sometimes contain details that investigators overlook. A telephone number can suddenly challenge a conviction. A forgotten statement can reveal a contradiction. A document can change the understanding of an entire timeline. The Maria Ridulph case has already demonstrated that the past can still surprise investigators. The danger is assuming that every surviving detail points toward the same conclusion. It may not. A cold case requires investigators to look at evidence without allowing previous theories to dictate what they see. That is especially important after a conviction has been overturned. The temptation would be to search immediately for another suspect, but the better approach is to return to the beginning and rebuild the timeline from the evidence. What happened before Maria disappeared? Who was in the area? What did Kathy see? What did the original investigators record? What vehicles were known to be nearby? What routes could have been used? What did the search reveal? What information was discarded? What information was never followed? These questions may not sound dramatic, but cold cases are often solved by details that initially appear insignificant. A single discrepancy can be